The young lady was in shock and did not understand how it had come to this. The men were puzzled and scared and looked away. The man was scared, and shaking with fear, he was afraid to raise his head. The tension in the hall was very high. At least cut it with a knife. The emperor waved his sword. The man shook with fear and asked His Majesty to give him one last chance. The hall filled with blood and screams. The young lady closed her eyes in fear. The emperor looked at everyone present with rage. He was simply beside himself with anger. The man looked at the emperor in shock. He did not know what to expect from him. The emperor approached the next one. He was very angry and did not control himself. The emperor's sword froze near the man's head, and he in turn froze in fear because he knew what the emperor was capable of. The young people looked closely at the young lady. They wanted her to save them. She was shocked she didn't understand why they were all looking at her. The young lady also didn't want to die. The emperor came closer to the man, and his sword scratched his throat. The young lady was scared and didn't know what to do. She understood that the emperor would soon take another life. A moment later, she approached the emperor, thereby blocking his path. The young lady hugged the emperor tenderly and asked him to calm down. She looked closely at the emperor. She wanted to help him. A moment later, the room was filled with light, and everyone held their breath. She looked at the emperor and said that everything would be fine, and he would be fine. She hugged him tenderly, thereby calming him down. She saw that he was already coming to his senses. Everyone looked at the emperor in surprise, and intently they were afraid of his further actions. The young lady knew what she had to do to live another day. At first, Ronaldina didn't believe how she could end up inside the novel. Later, she became the emperor's secretary. The young lady did not know that he was actually a tyrant. Ronaldina did not think that she would have to sacrifice herself. She did not imagine that she would be pulling him out of his murderous dope. She wanted to quit such a job. Ronaldina. She had previously dreamed of becoming a highly paid secretary, but now she just wanted to leave. She looked at the man and asked him to escort His Majesty to his chambers. Interview day for the position of imperial secretary. The young lady could have remained the duke's secretary, but she wanted more. Ronaldina came closer to the carriage. She was worried about the upcoming interview. She approached the knight and said that she had arrived to be interviewed for the position of secretary to the emperor. Ronaldina wanted to be the right hand of the most powerful man in the empire, and therefore her salary had to be high. She knew that this would bring her closer to creating a shelter for abandoned children. A moment later, she was called. The young man looked at the young lady and told her to follow him. Uciel introduced himself and said that he was the Minister of Finance. Uciel said that as soon as she passed the interview, she could immediately begin work as His Majesty's personal secretary. Ronaldina was surprised and asked if he really said that she would be his personal secretary. The current emperor Ivana has a strong reputation. Duran Verkin Radis turned the kingdom into a great empire. Ronaldina knew that it would be an honor for her to become His Majesty's private secretary. She was a little puzzled, as she had a feeling of déjà vu. Uciel asked her if he could ask her a few questions. Ronaldina said that he could ask anything he wanted to know if she had to save herself when faced with a wild animal or monster. They talked for some time. He said that Ronaldina is a knowledgeable girl. Uciel looked at her and said with a smile that he was surprised that she answered all his questions with ease. Ronaldina looked at him and said that it made her take her mind off the upcoming interview. He said that she had just passed the interview, but the last word was still with the emperor. Ronaldina was surprised. Uciel, standing outside the door, told the emperor that he had brought the applicant. The young lady was shocked. She was very scared and excited because she understood that she would now meet with the emperor. Uciel looked at her and said with a smile that the emperor should not be afraid. He wished her all the best. A moment later, she entered the hall. She saw the emperor, who was looking at her intently. The young lady looked at the emperor and greeted him. He looked at her and said she could raise her head. When their eyes met, she had a flashback. With icy eyes, he looked down at those who stood in front of him. His hair was black like ink, like the deep sea in the night. His golden eyes shone with ruthlessness. Ronaldina was surprised and did not know how to react. The emperor looked at her intently. He silently watched. Ronaldina was uncomfortable with his gaze. The young lady was scared and didn't know what to do. She was afraid of him and didn't know how to behave. She was afraid of his murderous gaze, since in the story he was a tyrant. A moment later, the emperor said that she had been accepted. Ronaldina was taken aback by his words. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She did not understand why he made a decision so quickly. The emperor said that she could be free. Ronaldina came to her senses and moved a little from her place. The young lady bowed. She wanted to leave him quickly. She was very scared and didn't know what to say. A moment later, she turned around and walked slowly. She was excited. With the speed of lightning, she approached the door because she wanted to leave quickly. She felt uneasy. Leaving the hall, she sighed heavily. Ronaldina was glad that it was all over. Usil quickly ran up to Ronaldina. He was very worried about her. He looked at her and asked if she had passed, trembling with fear. She said that she had passed. Looking at him, she asked if she could ask one question. Ronaldina was trembling with fear and did not know how to ask, since the question was not a pleasant one. A moment later, she asked if the emperor liked killing people around him. He asked if she knew the rumors about the emperor. She said she just sensed the tense atmosphere. The young man said that this was not true, and perhaps she was simply frightened by his charisma. Ronaldina was puzzled and did not know if this was true. She had difficulty comprehending the whole situation. She understood that her friend was simply a terrible liar. And it was even funny. She didn't have any hard evidence, but she could tell by the aura. She didn't want to be decapitated at work. She knew there was no turning back. But Ronaldina knew she couldn't run away. Now she knew she had no choice. In the novella, there was a female propagandist. She calmed the tyrant emperor until they eventually became happy. She understood that she was an excellent secretary, and everything would be fine. Ronaldina asked if she understood correctly that she would start work next week. Usiel said that as His Majesty's personal secretary, she should be near him at all times. The young lady was puzzled as the first day of work went very slowly. The emperor asked Usiel where the rest of the documents were. The emperor looked at the documents intently, not paying any attention to others. The young lady understood that she had to understand the intricacies of work in His Majesty's office. He said that there would be a meeting soon to discuss field research. The emperor said that he needed a summary. Usiel said that he would deliver his message, and since they did not know when it would end, he did not plan anything for the afternoon. Usiel asked Ronnie if she heard that they were discussing tomorrow's meeting. Ronaldina asked what needed to be prepared. He put the documents on the table and said with a smile that there was no need to prepare anything. He said that she only needed to join the meeting as the imperial secretary. She was surprised and didn't understand why he would do this if he didn't even know her. The day of the administrative meeting arrived. The young lady prepared as best she could. She stood in front of the hall. The young lady was very worried because she did not know how others would perceive her. But still, she knew that she could do it. Ronaldina knew that there was no turning back. A moment later, she entered the hall and saw that everyone had already gathered. She felt uneasy from the gaze. Usul greeted her with a smile. He wanted to hold her. Looking at him, she remembered some memories. She greeted everyone with a smile. She looked at her friend and asked if His Majesty would arrive soon. A moment later, the emperor entered the hall. The young people rose to greet him. The emperor shone in all his glory. The young lady looked at him with bated breath. A moment later, he sat down at the table and said they could begin. They discussed one issue for several hours. She took shorthand notes throughout the meeting. Usul told her to be sure to organize the notes she made. The emperor likes it when notes are short and concise. The young lady, puzzled, said that she understood everything. Ronaldina noticed the oppressive atmosphere. She shuddered as she heard that a quarrel was brewing. The man looked closely at the young lady and asked who made the decision to hire a commoner. She understood that she had to remain silent since they were having a meeting. The men argued because they did not want to be in the same room with her. Usiel told the man that he was behaving inappropriately. The emperor angrily asked if they were not currently having a meeting. He asked the man how dare he say such a thing in his presence. The cameraman asked Ronaldina which bill they postponed due to the fact that they did not reach a consensus. She asked if he was referring to the water supply system of the Ritti estate. The emperor asked what her opinion was on the matter. She said that the empire's canals rely heavily on the Ravada River, which flows through the center of the empire, where the soil is soft, and this makes construction difficult. Ronaldina said they were having problems getting water from the river, and the area had only recently been developed. The man looked at the emperor and asked what an ordinary secretary might know about this topic. The emperor told her to continue. She said that instead of relying on the river, They should use the water that flows from the nearby mountains. They can solve this problem. They built an above-ground water filtration station. She said neighboring states have successfully implemented similar filtration systems. The emperor looked at them and asked who had a better idea than his secretary's proposal. He said that she had found a solution, which they struggled with for a long time. This shows her competence. The emperor said that he chose her himself. She was in shock and did not understand how he knew that she had a solution to this issue. Ronaldina felt unsettled. After this, the meeting moved very quickly, and she began to look at the ruler in a more positive way. She came closer to them and said that he needed to think about this issue. The emperor told her to put the papers on the table. The young lady leisurely placed all the papers on the emperor's desk. She looked at Tyrant and asked if she should order the servants to prepare food for him. The emperor said that he was not hungry. She looked at him intently, and he seemed to her completely different from the one in the story. The more time she spent as his secretary, the more she began to wonder why he was considered a tyrant. One thing bothered her very much and could not get out of her thoughts. Since Duran drank some strange potion, she did not know what he was sick with. The maid came to the emperor's office. Ronaldina said that a tailor had arrived to take his measurements. The emperor looked at the documents and told the maid to wait a little. She was surprised because she didn't think that trying on clothes was also his job. But on the other hand, he is the face of the empire, and he is always dressed impeccably and always neat and stylish. She looked at him intently and caught his angry gaze. The lady was taken aback when the emperor passed near her. She was afraid. She still thought that she should focus on her work. Ronaldina thought about the novel she was reading and everything that happened there. A moment later, she looked up at her friend as she caught him looking at her. Ronaldina looked at him in surprise because she wanted to ask something. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she really wanted to say something. She asked if he had a younger sister. Usual smiled and said that she was much younger than him. She looked at him intently, not knowing how to ask a question. Usil looked at her in surprise and called out, because he saw that she wanted to ask something else. A moment later, she asked if he and His Majesty had grown up by chance. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew. The young lady was taken aback, because she realized that she had made a mistake, and realized it too late. She looked at him and said with a smile that she noticed how close they were to each other, so she guessed. He said that the emperor was quite a scary person, but that didn't explain how she got the idea that they knew each other from a very young age. She smiled and said that it was just her intuition, and it had never let her down. Ronaldina was sure that this was a fairy tale world, since everything was real, and what she remembered seemed very real, but she knew that it was not so. Ronaldina was puzzled, because she didn't know if she could survive in such a world. And what she read turns out to be true. Then His Majesty is definitely a tyrant. To survive, she must remember the entire plot. But unfortunately, in the real world, she read too many books. Ronaldina only knew that the propagandist girl would lead a delegation from a neighboring country. But that won't happen for the next 6 months. She said thinking about it doesn't do any good. Uciel was walking leisurely in the evening. He was wondering why she asked such questions. He understood that she knew more about His Majesty than she showed. Uciel thought that he was still bothering himself with this in vain. Uciel told the emperor that this was the only applicant for such a position, since the emperor made the other applicants run away in tears. Uciel said she fits the bill and has excellent references. Her previous employers spoke highly of her. Uciel said that he could not serve as his treasurer and secretary. At the same time, the emperor said that he did not understand why. Uciel hoped that she would not leave, because he understood that without her, he would be lost. Ronaldina was beginning to get used to life in the royal palace. Ronaldina wondered how many days she had worked here. They never sent her the promised maid, but she got used to doing everything herself. She thought that being the emperor's secretary might not be such a bad thing. She knew that although this was a difficult job, the salary was great. She needed to tell the emperor that the people wanted an audience with him. She thought that life inside the novel was not so bad after all. His Majesty was not as tyrant as he was portrayed to be. Entering the room, she was horrified. Ronnie saw a very terrible sight. She was scared because she didn't know what was happening. She was scared, and she didn't know what to do. She saw the emperor covered in blood. It was a terrible sight. Duran swung his sword, and she was horrified. She thought that she had made a mistake, and that he was a tyrant. The young lady screamed as she was scared and feared for her life. She was already overwhelmed by everything she saw. She did not expect this. The emperor looked at her intently. Ronaldina was shocked, as he did not look like himself. She knew that she needed to run as quickly as possible, but she could not budge. She understood that at this rate he could harm her. The emperor was shocked, he said in a trembling voice, that he needed to stop. She was shaking and crying. Ronaldina was afraid that he might harm her. She knew that he had two small bells on his table, a small one for calling the doctor, and the other golden bell is intended to call Uciel. Uciel ran into the room. The emperor said that he wanted him to take care of Ronnie, since she seemed to be in shock. The young man looked closely at the secretary. He came closer to her and asked if she was all right. Uciel asked her, "Why don't she go to her room?" He said that he would take care of everything himself. He was sorry that she had to go through this. When she finally collected her thoughts, it was already well after midnight. She was shocked and did not think that he was such a tyrant as he was portrayed in the novel. This might be a fairy tale world, but right now it was still her reality, and she was very scared. When she appeared in this world after her death, she was very hungry and cold. She lay on the street, slowly losing consciousness. She thought she was going to die. But fortunately for her, her saviors appeared. Ronaldina sighed heavily as she felt relieved. They were real abandoned orphans. But with their help, she found a place where she could stay for a while. But the orphanage was located in the slums where scammers took advantage of children. She was an adult trapped in a child's body. The children she was with were innocent. She had to do something. Realizing that secretaries received high salaries, she stirred up her memories of the past and began to study as hard as she could. And for the next 16 years, she began working as the Baron's secretary. She slowly rose until she became the Duke's secretary. She was able to save children from the orphanage. Ronaldina dreamed of giving them a new life. When Modana took her from the shelter, she began to dream. She wanted to take the money and save not only the children around her. The young lady looked at Ronaldina and asked if she was okay. She looked at the girl in surprise as she looked like her friend. Ronaldina asked who she was, since she did not expect to see anyone in her chambers. The girl said that she wanted to come earlier, but Parliament still couldn't decide. She couldn't believe that there were people like that who made all the important decisions for them. Mevin Moella introduced herself and said that she was the maid of honor. Ronaldina said that she heard that she was coming. Mevin said that she heard that an unpleasant incident happened to her this afternoon. Ronaldina thought that the palace was the safest place in the empire. She said that she doesn't want to leave yet because there is a lot of work, and the salary's really high. She wanted to open a shelter for abandoned children, but this requires a lot of money, and the emperor's secretary is the highest-paying job. Mevin said with a smile that Ronaldina should hold on as Ronaldina now has her. She said with a smile that she knew everything about court gossip, Ronaldina said, with a smile that she was better now. In fact, the maid was really helpful. She kept her so tense that she didn't have time to process what had happened. Thanks to the maid, she felt much better, and she was glad for that, since she had been through a lot. The maid wished her good night. Ronaldina answered her with a smile and wished her good night. She hoped that things would get better and that everything would be fine with the emperor. She was shocked, as she did not know that His Majesty suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Uciel said he couldn't go into detail, but His Majesty suffered from nightmares caused by childhood traumas. His symptoms worsened, and he started hallucinating, causing his world to become distorted. The emperor took medicine to perform his duties efficiently. The medicine is made from various poisonous herbs. It wreaks havoc on the body, so he only takes it when he feels the drug's effects are starting to wear off. This meant it was difficult to tell when the medicine was starting to wear off. Ronnie was scared and didn't want to be alone with him. Entering the office, she was surprised. Since there was no one there, she realized that something was wrong. She looked at the office in surprise, since it was suspicious that no one was there at such a time. A moment later, she saw the emperor lying on the floor. She came closer to him, asked if he was okay. She was worried about Duran. She touched him and saw his evil look. She was in shock, did not understand what she had gotten herself into. Slowly, she walked away from him, but a moment later, he grabbed her. Ronaldina was in shock and screaming. He looked at her intently and said in a trembling voice that it was not because of him. She was shocked because she realized that, again, he was at his best. Ronaldina wanted to help him. Regretting that she didn't have enough time to shower her son with love, was a storyline that resurfaced in her memories. Her pale hand fell, leaving a bloody imprint on her son's cheek. Ronaldina froze and looked at the Emperor. She wanted to save him from suffering. She touched his face tenderly. Durand did not react at all. Tears flowed from his eyes. He called out to his mother in a trembling voice. A moment later, the Emperor fell on top of Ronaldina. She was in shock and called him because it was hard for her, and she didn't know what to do with him. A moment later, they fell to the ground with a roar. UCL burst into the office and asked for forgiveness for being late. He was shocked by what he saw. UCL could not utter a word. Ronaldina looked at him and angrily asked why he was always late. She said that he was just terrible. After the Emperor went to bed, she sorted out the documents. UCL said that it seems that the Emperor has developed an immunity to the medicine, and they will have to look for another drug. She understood that they would also need to find a way to calm her down. UCL looked at her and asked, "Why don't she take a week's break?" She looked at him in surprise. She asked if he had the right to do such things. He said that he was sure this situation would affect her mental health, and he would take care of her responsibilities. While she rested, Ronnie knew that if he refused, he could change his mind. She said that she would take a break. While on vacation, she thought about the Emperor's condition. Ronnie knew that this had something to do with his mother. She was wondering what had happened, but Ronnie did not dare to ask about it. She knew that he was cheerful and playful, but then everything changed. He rushed with a smile because he was sure that she would like it. But a moment later, he was enveloped in darkness. He was scared and uneasy. He looked dumbfounded into the darkness. It was frightening. A moment later, he saw his mother Durand staring at her. She slowly approached him, hugging and talking to him. She whispered in his ear that it was all his fault he was scared. The Emperor woke up breathing heavily. He woke up from a nightmare. He was in shock because he had a nightmare. Durand was having a hard time. Yushil looked at the Emperor and asked if he was okay. The Emperor looked at his friend. The Emperor knew that if Yushil was here now, it meant that he had been away too long. The Emperor looked at his friend and, puzzled, said that not everything was all right with him. A moment later, he noticed that someone was missing. Durand asked where his secretary was. Yushil said that he gave her a week's break. The Emperor was shocked. Looking at the Emperor, he said with a smile that he was already working for 2 people, so he had no need to worry. The Emperor looked at him and asked why she was missing. Yusiel slowly handed him the documents. He said that the Emperor attacked her while he was unconscious, but fortunately, no one was hurt. The Emperor was shocked. He looked at his friend and told him to repeat it. Deror was in shock as he realized he was trying to harm his secretary, and she took a week off. His hallucinations did not stop until he saw blood. Yushil said that he appeared immediately after he lost consciousness. When he first arrived, he was already asleep. The Emperor was in shock. He did not understand how he could immediately fall asleep. Darren did not know if this was possible, but he remembered something. It was hard for him from these memories. Lucretia is the name of the Emperor's mother. She was sad that she could not give her son more love. She searched slowly and for a long time, but apparently there was no information about the Emperor's childhood. Ronaldina remembered the sad face of the Emperor. She wanted to help him. There are absolutely no records left about the former king and queen. Either she did not search well, or all the information was destroyed. She did not understand why they did this, but still Ronnie did not give up and continued the search. She ended up spending a whole week researching the Emperor's past. Entering the office, she asked how the Emperor was feeling. She felt awkward next to him. The Emperor was surprised that she returned. Darren thought that she would run away after everything. The Emperor looked at her intently. He still could not believe that she had returned. She looked at her, asked if he wanted her to do something. The Emperor said that this was not entirely true. She knew that of course he wasn't worried about her. A moment later, she saw a folder of folded documents. The young lady was very surprised. Yushil did everything while she was away. Ronnie was glad of that. So they resolved the issue of the estate. The audience went well, and as a result, a delegation from Poyern comes. Yushil called Ronnie. He said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. He asked if she managed to rest. She looked at him in surprise and asked what it all meant. He said that now his heart sank into his heels. Ronnie asked if they should really accept the delegation. He said it was quite a lie. Yes, but they were sending a delegation to discuss trade with their empire. Ronnie asked when they would arrive. He said that they still needed to discuss the details. but they should arrive in 3 months. In the book, the main character visited Avern during the arrival of a foreign delegation. She thought that maybe this was it. However, she knew that Poyern was an island. Roni wondered if the propagandist was from there. Usual said that this is why they are holding urgent meetings today. He told the emperor that he must prepare. The young lady looked at them, puzzled. Ronaldina knew what awaited her. The young people quarreled and said that they did not need to improve relations with them. They argued that Poyen was just an unknown island, and they had nothing to gain from making connections. The young people said not to be prejudiced by the fact that this is a small island. Ronnie looked at her colleague and asked what he thought about this. He said that he was thinking about everything now. The emperor looked at his secretary and asked if everyone had spoken. She looked at him in surprise. The emperor said that they could discuss everything when the delegation arrived, but now he only needed their opinion. The emperor looked at the treasurer and secretary and asked what they thought. They said with a smile that they agreed. Ronnie did not quite agree. She said that not much was known about the island since it was closed off from the rest of the world. But from what she heard, there was one similarity. The island grows rare plants and herbs that are not found on the continent. The island used herbs to develop its non-medicinal industry. If they establish contact with them, their medical industry will advance greatly. The men said that this was not enough to sign an agreement. She knew that some people were grasping at straws for this opportunity. She saw people die from disease in the slums. The elite may not notice. They definitely need advances in medicine. She knew that this would be beneficial to the people of the empire. The emperor looked at everyone present and said that the voices were divided. The emperor said that he would wait and see what they wanted to discuss during the negotiations, and with that, he closed the meeting. She understood that everything had not gone as expected, and in order to survive, she needed the propagandist to arrive as quickly as possible. Uciel looked at her and asked how she knew so much about Poyerna. She said she had read a book about the islands a couple of years ago, and it had information about the island. He smiled and said that she probably had a good memory. She told him with a smile to stop flattering her, as this was useless. She knew that she had a lot of work ahead of her, but still Ronaldina did not intend to give up. The next thing she needed to do was get everything ready for the banquet. Usul looked at her and said that there was something she needed to do. He said that the emperor wanted her to organize a banquet. He said that the emperor knew that Parliament had a claim against her, and this was the perfect opportunity to prove them wrong. After Duran's reign, Vercandus Avernus, once a small kingdom, grew into a huge empire. No one dares to go against him, and neighboring countries send gifts every year in memory of the day when Avernus became emperor. And to celebrate this event, the empire held an annual banquet, the emperor maintaining simplicity and modesty. Ronnie knew that the propagandist would arrive immediately after the banquet. Ronnie did not know what to do when she arrived. She found out that the banquet was just around the corner, but she was not mentally prepared for it. She wondered if everything would be okay, as she was so worried about everything. She knew that it was too late to back down. Ronaldina knew that she had to do everything in the best possible way. She knew she had a lot of work to do at the moment. Uciel saw her and greeted her. Ronnie said with a smile that she was looking for him. Uciel said that he would like to help her. He also apologized for dumping everything on her. She said that there was nothing to worry about, since she had the best architects of the empire at hand, and she is sure that managing finances is a much more difficult task. He looked at her and smiled. She looked at him and asked why he believed she was fit to host the banquet. He said that the Duke had great respect for her, and thanks to her notes, he could imagine what the banquet would look like. He said he couldn't wait to watch everything when it was ready. He smiled and said goodbye to her. She was very glad to have such a nice conversation. Ronnie calmed down a little. She knew that she had a lot to do, and yet she was determined to achieve a good result. Entering the room, she saw the maid. Mevin smiled and greeted the young lady. She smiled and said that they needed to prepare her dress for the ball. Ronnie froze in surprise, as she had completely forgotten about it. Mevin looked at the young lady and said that she came from a family of fashion designers. Ronnie was surrounded by a crowd of maids. She said their family has been designing and owning stores for centuries. She said with a smile that the young lady was in good hands and she would make the perfect dress for her. Ronnie was surprised. Mevin said that once they took her measurements, they could evaluate the options and choose a style of clothing. They could have chosen something luxurious, since this was an imperial banquet after all. They thought they could settle on mystery and innocence. Mevin said that since she was His Majesty's secretary, they could choose a formal style. This adds to her image of insight and confidence. Ronnie asked if she was sure that she could do it. The day of the banquet arrived. Ronnie hoped that His Majesty was already inside. The young people discussed the palace and said that it would be a shame if everything was as miserable as a year ago. They hoped that the banquet would last not too long, since the previous banquets had not been very impressive. A moment later, everyone saw the magnificent statues. The guests were amazed. This is a palace, a place where many luxurious balls were held in the past, but the palace had its flaws. Mevin was surprised that the damaged areas were covered with colorful curtains, and strategically placed lamps gave the hall an ethereal look. The young people were discussing the banquet. They hoped that in the future, the emperor would hold such banquets. They also said that it was all the secretary who did it. Ronnie was puzzled, since organizing a banquet is not an easy task. Sometime later, the emperor appeared in the hall. Everyone was looking at him intently. Ronaldina looked closely at the emperor. He was beautiful. She was puzzled because she had not realized this until now. But His Majesty was able to win the trust of his people. She wondered if he was the terrible tyrant she had read about in the novel. She wondered if he, the emperor, was loved by his people, or perhaps he was an emperor suffering from childhood trauma. She stared at him and wondered who he really was. The emperor looked at them all and thanked them for joining him today. Ronnie was surprised, as she did not expect that this would be all he would say at the banquet. A moment later, music filled the hall as the guests enjoyed the banquet. The young lady looked intently at the guests, who were enjoying the banquet, and at the emperor. He looked at her. She knew she shouldn't break eye contact. A moment later, the honorable partners of the empire were greeted. Ronnie realized that she was saved. Devon Piff greeted the emperor. He said that he was one of those who served the emperor. The man was a far-sighted businessman with a rich biography. While they were talking, Ronnie watched them. She noticed that he was a pleasant conversationalist, and the lady who was next to him was his daughter. Vera Piff greeted the emperor. Devon Piff said that this time the banquet looks different from last year. He said that everyone was enchanted as soon as they crossed the threshold. He said a lot more for a while. He wanted to introduce his daughter. Ronnie looked at them intently, as the young lady's name seemed very familiar to her. The man looked at her angrily and said that she needed to know her place. Ronaldina was shocked by the man's behavior. He looked at the emperor and asked what a commoner was doing here. The young lady froze in bewilderment. She felt uneasy from such a question at such an event. Ronaldina looked closely at the young people. A lot of young ladies approached her because they wanted to get to know her. Naif Irnadon said with a smile that she was very pleased to meet her. The ladies also greeted her with a smile and introduced themselves. She looked at them in surprise and also introduced herself. One of the young ladies said that they could dispense with the formalities since she was the organizer of the banquet after all. She didn't expect so many people to pay attention to her. Everything shocked her, because she did not expect that there would be such an atmosphere. The young lady came closer to her and said with a smile that she would be happy to send her an invitation. Usiel said that this unfortunately is impossible, since she has a lot of things to do. He said that with their permission, he will take the lady. The young people were shocked because they wanted to talk to her. A moment later, she stood on the terrace and watched the starry sky. He told her not to be surprised if people started sending her gifts. She looked at him in surprise. He said that's what they call bribes. He's sure she'll do a great job, but he wanted to warn her. She said she'd mean it. The next day, the man looked at her and asked if she had a minute. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if this was a foreign minister. He said he was impressed by her extensive knowledge of foreign affairs, and I would like to ask her for help. She thought that it wouldn't hurt to do him a favor. Ronnie said that she doesn't know how useful she can be to him, and now he's busy with work. She wanted to discuss his request later. The man said that the effect of the medicine is getting shorter and shorter. The emperor's body is becoming more and more resistant to the drug. Usul asked, "What about the emperor's health?" The doctor said that naturally it was not very good. His body absorbed the poison. He said that preparing medicine for the emperor is only a temporary measure, not a basic replacement. He said that at this rate, the emperor could faint at any moment. Ronnie was shocked by what she heard. She remembered the emperor saying that it was not his fault. She couldn't do anything and knew it was none of her business. Since she will be leaving the palace soon, Ronnie knew that today the main character would arrive in two. They sat in the banquet hall and said, waiting for a delegation from Poyern. She was very happy, as she was soon to return to the duchy. She hoped that this would happen soon, and that she would finally be free. The emperor greeted the delegation. He said that he was sure it had been a long journey. Representatives of the delegation greeted the emperor. Vatern introduced himself with a smile and said that he was the head of the delegation. The young lady was surprised that he was a man. The young lady listened to them intently, but still she was shocked as she expected a different development of events. She expected to see the main character, but unfortunately she did not see her. Ronnie wondered if the main character was not the head of the delegation. Avernus is a huge country. She was sure that many countries wanted to send a delegation to them. The emperor looked at them and asked if it was true that they knew about plants. A moment later, he turned his gaze to the secretary. She looked at him in surprise. Ronnie asked the emperor if he needed anything. The emperor said that he did not need anything. The head of the delegation was presented with the trade agreement they had reached. He smiled and thanked for the document. The emperor ordered the delegation to be taken to the Rodivan palace. The young lady was surprised as it ended quickly. The head of the delegation thanked the emperor for the audience and said that they were looking forward to the opportunity to work. The emperor and his secretary slowly returned to the cabin. The young lady walked lost in her thoughts. She was a little surprised because the emperor stopped. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was okay. She was shocked as she realized that the meeting had gone on longer than it should have. One small rumor can spread very quickly, especially if it concerns the emperor. If he sees them now, then everyone will know the emperor's secrets. She looked at him and asked if she could help him, but she heard nothing in response. She heard some noise. The young lady wanted to help him, but he rejected her help. At the same time, he threw her hand away. The emperor looked sideways at her. He didn't want to hurt her. As he walked up the stairs, he said he was fine, and she didn't need to touch him. She wanted to help him, and did not intentionally try to touch him. A moment later, she heard someone speaking to her. She looked at the young people and asked if their guest was being given a tour. The young people said with a smile that they were heading to the palace. She smiled and said that she understood everything. She hoped they would have a good time in Averna. The head of the delegation smiled back at her. The emperor sat in his office and looked at the documents in puzzlement. He looked at Ronnie and told her to leave the documents on the table. Ronnie asked for a few minutes since she had not yet finished with the documents. She carefully examined the documents and dealt with them. A moment later, she heard a crash. The young lady froze in place. She saw the emperor fall to the ground. With the speed of lightning, she ran up to him. She was shocked and screamed to the emperor. The emperor told her to call Rigot. She knew she should run away now, but she had mixed feelings. She looked intently at the emperor. He looked very bad. The emperor pierced her with a cold gaze. Ronnie was puzzled because she didn't know what to do. A moment later, the emperor grabbed her hands. She was dumbfounded. A moment later, they fell to the ground. The young lady was shocked. She asked the emperor to calm down. She told him that everything was fine and everything would be fine. The emperor hugged her. The young lady was shocked and screamed for him to wait. She understood that he was not himself and did not hear her. She was shocked as they were now touching lips. She was shocked and also very embarrassed. My lady asked the emperor to let her go. She wanted to push him away, but she couldn't. She said she needed to get up. The doctor looked at the young lady and said that he heard that she was looking for him. He said that he helped the emperor yesterday after he fell and lost consciousness. She thanked him. Ronnie said she was here to see if he could find another way to cure the emperor. After all, his condition is only getting worse. He asked her if she wanted to say that the island had many plants and medicinal herbs unknown on the continent. She said that the head of the delegation told the emperor so. The doctor said that it would be great if they found useful and medicinal herbs. She said they might as well end up empty-handed. The doctor said that even if she hurts herself, they will still gather important information. The doctor said that there is something special in the drugs being created. They injure the body and have unpleasant side effects. He said that since the emperor's life was at stake, they must do everything in their power to find the necessary medicines. He looked at her and asked if she had told the delegation that they would be visiting them. She sighed heavily because she had forgotten. A moment later, they saw the head of the delegation. They watched him in surprise. A moment later, they slowly approached him. Ronnie introduced herself again. The head of the delegation smiled and said that he remembered them, and he also asked what issue they came to him about. Ronnie asked if he could introduce them to an expert on plants and herbs, and it will be good if he has knowledge in medicine. He smiled and said that they had come to the right place since he knew a lot about medicine and was versed in botany research. Sometime later, they sat in the room and discussed pressing issues. The doctor looked at the head and said that what they say now should remain between them. The head agreed. The doctor hesitated a little because he didn't know where to start. A moment later, he said they had a case and it involved trauma. The head looked at the doctor in surprise and asked why he fell silent mid-sentence. The doctor asked that they swear to secrecy. The head asked if he should sign something. Ronnie was shocked. She looked at the doctor in surprise and asked if he wanted the head to sign a non-disclosure document. The doctor said it was just for peace of mind. He said the nightmares continue and hallucinations appear even after waking up. This reveals a tendency towards violence, and it hurts not only this person, but also those around him. They fought a war for many years to become the empire that it is today. At first, he thought that this injury was connected precisely with these events, but later, upon detailed analysis, it turned out that the injury had been caused much earlier. The patient currently lives in a country house. The doctor said they couldn't control it anymore, and they needed to find another cure. The head of the delegation said that there is no remedy that can eradicate this kind of problem. Ronnie was shocked because she hoped that he would help them, but he said that he knows such injuries are needed, and to prepare a medicine that can help. The doctor was shocked. He looked at the head and asked if he was serious. The head of the association apologized and said that was all he could do to help. The doctor said with a smile that this was more than enough. He gave them full and changed the angle of view of their research. Ronnie sighed heavily because I felt relieved. The leader said that tomorrow he would collect the herbs they needed so they can come tomorrow. Ronnie looked at the doctor and asked where the country house came from. He said that his father was looking after the emperor. She was surprised and wondered if he really substituted his own father for the sake of the emperor. She wondered what kind of person he was. She wondered if that made him a loyal servant or an immoral man. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. The head of the delegation slowly approached her. He said he brought the herbs they talked about yesterday. The young lady is fussing. I thanked him. She hoped he didn't hear what she was saying. He said that this plant is called renpum. This is a very effective plant. Although the plant is rare, it is not poisonous. He said it should be brewed like tea. Ronnie thanked him. She was glad that the plant was not poisonous. She looked at him and said with a smile that if he needed anything according to his height, he needed to let her know. And she will certainly help him. Sir Wahern said with a smile that nothing like that had happened yet. Ronnie knew that if it helped the emperor, he would be her savior. She said that with his permission, she would deviate. Sir Wahern looked after her with a smile. Mevin smiled and asked if this was new tea. Ronnie said she thought she should start trying. Mevin looked at her mistress and said that she had a day off tomorrow. She asked what her plans were tomorrow. Ronnie said she planned to study tomorrow. She looked at her maid in surprise and asked why she was asking. Mevin said that she would like to have a tea ceremony tomorrow. She asked if Ronnie would like to come. Ronnie said with a smile that it would be nice. She said they were just going to enjoy dessert. Ronnie smiled and said that she would definitely come. Mevin said with a smile that she couldn't wait for this moment. Ronnie was surprised and did not understand why the young lady was so eager to see her boss on her day off. She didn't say why she agreed, but it was a tea party she shouldn't have gone to. Arriving at the gate, she asked for forgiveness for being late, as she was sure that the others had already arrived. She was surprised such declarations were wonderful. She knew that they were considered fashionable for a reason. She looked at everything intently and in surprise. A moment later, she saw a familiar girl. Ronnie was surprised and did not understand why the girl decided to sit opposite the place of honor. The young lady looked intently at Ronnie, with a grin on his face. Ronnie felt uncomfortable in such an environment. Vera watched Ronnie closely. A moment later, she said with a grin that there was a hair on her lips. Moments later, Vera turned to Ronaldina and asked if she was His Majesty's personal secretary. The young lady said with a smile that it meant something. A moment later, she asked if Ronaldina was a commoner. The young lady said that she was sure that His Majesty had to hire a commoner. She was surprised, and with a grin asked Ronaldina what trick she used. The young lady with a grin asked Ronnie if she was listening to her. Ronnie wanted to play with them a little. She looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if that was all she wanted to tell her. The young lady looked contemptuously at the secretary and asked if she was listening to her. She held a cup of tea behind her back. Ronnie suddenly screamed for everyone. The young lady was surprised. She looked at Ronnie and asked why she was screaming. At that moment, she remembered something. The villain who was constantly in the way of the main character, Varika Piff Roni, was sure that she was egging others on. The young lady looked at Ronnie and asked if she was threatening her. A moment later, the cup fell to the ground. Ronnie was surprised as the young lady dropped the cup herself. Ronnie knew the young lady shouldn't blame her for this. Verica looked at Ronnie and said that this was absolutely not the right atmosphere to enjoy tea. Verica said Lady Serena got her dress dirty, and Lady Ronaldina seemed shocked. Verica asked, "Why don't they finish the tea party?" She looked at Lady Medella and asked if she minded. Lady Medella said furiously that she absolutely agreed. Lady Serena looked at Verica. She was shocked by everything that happened. Verica came closer to Ronnie and said with a smile that she was pleased to meet her. A moment later, Verica said with anger and a grin that Ronnie's work belonged to her. Ronnie was surprised by what she heard, but she didn't react at all. Lady Medella approached Ronnie. She was shocked by what happened. Serena was very angry. She looked at Ronnie with fury. Ronnie was shocked. She wondered if, after everything, they had become enemies. Mevin tearfully asked Ronnie for forgiveness. The young lady looked at the lovely ladies and told them not to worry with a smile, because at first it seems a little intrusive. More next time, they were also very happy to meet her. Mevin was furious. She said that Verica had been pursuing His Majesty for a long time. Maven said that she has been trying to make fun of everyone since she was refused the position of secretary to His Majesty. But there is little they can do. The Piff family has deep pockets. Mevin said puzzled that this was not at all how she imagined Ronnie's first tea parties. Ronnie said with a smile that everything was fine. Ronnie took a leisurely walk in the evening. While walking around the palace, she noticed a guard. She was very glad that she wore the shawl. She slowly returned to her room. She was in a good mood as the walk helped her clear her head. But she still wondered who this Varika thought she was. Ronnie communicated with a mini panther statue. She couldn't believe that she managed to attract the attention of the villainess. Since she was glad to take care of His Majesty, when they found the cure and the main character made her grand entrance, then she was going to leave. She wanted to check the top floor. Walking up the stairs, she noticed that the guard was sleeping. She didn't want to wake the knight, she just wanted to pass him by, unnoticed. She successfully passed him. She was surprised because she noticed that it was too quiet. She felt like something was wrong. She didn't see anything. The young lady wondered if this was an abandoned part of the estate. A moment later, she saw the light. She should have been relaxing because she saw the light. She knew that there was a great threat hidden in this dark castle, an unstable and dubious type of threat. The emperor in a trembling voice said that he was not to blame. He told her not to come closer and to leave, and generally stayed away from him. A moment later, his tears began to flow. The emperor shouted. He begged his mother not to die. He didn't want her to leave him. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect to see this. She didn't try to compare herself as a child with him. She was sure that other people would also feel sorry for him. It's human nature to want to help someone who needs it. She came closer to him and said that everything was fine. She touched him tenderly. She was next to him and wanted to help him. She saw sweat running down his face. A moment later, he moved closer to her. She was shocked and asked him to wait. She was in shock and did not understand why he was so close to her. His heart was beating very hard. She couldn't push him away. He hugged her tightly. She was shocked because she forgot that her shirt was transparent. She asked him to wait. The young lady was shocked. She asked why he was touching her like that. Ronnie wanted him to just kiss her, and they would be done with it. A moment later, their gazes crossed. A moment later, he kissed her. She could smell his skin. She was so nervous that she could barely even breathe. A moment later, he lost consciousness. The young lady looked around. She realized that they were in his chambers. The young lady slowly pulled him closer to the bed. She regretted that she did not take time to exercise since the emperor was very heavy. She was surprised and wondered how he could fall asleep after such a kiss. Her heart was still pounding. A moment later, he grabbed her hand. She was in shock because she was very scared. Ronnie was surprised she didn't understand why he was doing this to her. The young lady sighed heavily. She looked intently at the Emperor. Sitting near the Emperor, she noticed that you couldn't see the stars in his window. Ronnie wanted to leave as soon as he fell asleep. She was very tired. Ronnie thought that perhaps she had simply spent too much effort getting him into bed. Early in the morning, the Emperor woke up. He felt very calm, but still he was surprised since he was sitting on the floor. He wondered if he had a cloudiness, but still he felt no pain. He felt very relaxed. The Emperor understood that it was time to get to work. A moment later, he saw that he was holding someone's hand. He looked in surprise and intently at the young lady who was next to him. He was surprised because he did not expect to see her next to him. Ronnie slept peacefully next to him. He was shocked because he realized that he had not let her leave. He hoped he wasn't holding her hand too tightly. He was puzzled because he told the guards not to let anyone in. He wondered if he should punish them for neglecting their duties. He looked closely at the young lady. The Emperor wondered if she had helped him again. He didn't want her to suffer because of him. The Emperor slowly picked up the young lady as he wanted to carry her to the bed. He carried her in his arms, and I was very surprised since it was very light. He was surprised and didn't understand why he wasn't repulsed by her touch. He looked at her intently. The Emperor was surprised, since he had never looked at anyone so closely. The young lady was sleeping peacefully in bed. She was shocked because she realized that she had fallen asleep like a baby on the Emperor's bed. She was shocked and didn't understand how she could look him in the face after that. Entering the office, she greeted everyone. Uciel greeted her with a smile. He said that His Majesty said that she was late. She timidly apologized for being late. She knew that she came so late because of one person, but still she could not say anything. She had no choice but to apologize for being late. She knew that he was guilty of everything. The Emperor looked at her and asked if she slept well. She looked at him timidly because she did not know what to answer him. He smiled and told her not to worry. She looked at him in surprise. Uciel looked at the Emperor and said that he seemed to be in a good mood today. He said that he had not seen him so rested for a long time. Uciel looked at the Emperor and asked if the doctor had developed a cure. The Emperor said that he did not take any medicine. The nightmare just stopped in the middle. The Emperor smiled and said that he most likely fell asleep after that. She looked at him intently because she didn't think he remembered their kisses. She wondered if that kiss had helped him get rid of the nightmare. The Emperor looked at her and said that he had not slept long. Uciel looked at the Emperor and asked if they could find out why the nightmare had stopped. The Emperor knew that this would be very difficult to do. Uciel looked at the young lady and said that the administrative meeting would be held this afternoon. He left the materials on her desk. He asked her to read them before the meeting began. The young lady said that she would do everything. The man looked closely at the Emperor and said that he should find himself a wife. He said that marriage is an important factor for the imperial family. They begged him to at least look at the list. For some time, they listed the young ladies and said that they were not only beautiful, but also smart. Ronnie listened to them, but she didn't feel very comfortable. The man looked at the Emperor and asked him to look at the list. He said that he believed the candidate had all the qualities necessary to become Empress. He said he recommended the princess the Emperor puzzled, said that he had had enough. She heard the man begin to talk about Princess Celia Trumi. Since she knew that this was the main character, they looked at the Emperor and said that it was his duty. The Emperor said with grayness that they should leave quickly. Uciel jumped out of his chair and told everyone to leave now. He said to call the doctor. In an instant, everyone left the hall one by one. She understood that she also had to hurry. Uciel shouted to her to be careful, since the Emperor was behind. The young lady froze. Uciel shouted for her to turn around. The young lady turned around and saw the Emperor. With lightning speed, she hugged him. Ronnie gently said that everything would be fine. She tried to calm him down. She repeated several times that everything would be fine. She prayed it would work. The Emperor was breathing heavily. He wanted to tell her something, but he didn't get it. Everyone was shocked. They froze in bewilderment. They didn't understand how this was possible. Since previously, no one could calm the Emperor. Uciel looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she had managed to calm the Emperor for the 4th time. He didn't understand how this was possible. She looked at him timidly and did not know what to answer. He said he wouldn't ask her to go into detail. However, he didn't know if it could be called a skill, but since this was the fourth time she had succeeded, it definitely meant something. He looked at her and said that he knew that this was a huge request, but still he asked her to take care of His Majesty. Ronnie was shocked. Ronnie said the Emperor relaxed when she hugged him. She was sure it would work next time. He said His Majesty would prefer people to keep their distance. Yusiel looked at her and said that he was ready to raise her salary. She timidly said that it wasn't about the money. What frightened her was that the Emperor was very persistent. But then he didn't remember anything. He looked at her and said that he knew that calming His Majesty would not be an easy task, but now they were grasping at any straw. Ronnie looked at him and asked if he could give her a day to think about it. She was furious because she understood that it was not she who should calm the Emperor. She knew that the main character should do this. She understood that at this rate he would never meet the main character. The Empire would be in danger unless they found a way to appease the Emperor. She wondered if maybe she should leave the Empire after all. But still, she knew that moving to another country would not be easy. Ronnie understood that she had no choice but to accept the offer. The Emperor looked at her and asked if it was she who put him to bed. She looked at him in surprise because she did not know what to answer. Ronnie didn't know if she should tell him everything. Ronnie didn't know how to do this, since she couldn't say that she had read about it in a novel. The Emperor looked at her and said that everything was fine, as he just wanted to know how he fell asleep. That's it. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She looked at him and asked if that meant he didn't need her help anymore. The Emperor said that he no longer needed help. Ronnie looked at him and said that she understood everything. She knew he would answer like that. She knew it was good, because it was time for her to get back to work. She checked the records and saw that His Majesty was soon going to a banquet to celebrate his birthday. She looked at the Emperor and said that they should go to the main living room. In a few minutes, he has a suit fitting. She looked closely at the Emperor. She brought up that she had become too sloppy lately. Yusil looked at her and asked if she had thought about everything. Ronnie looked at him and said that she was going to give him a positive answer. But it seemed that the Emperor had completely different thoughts on this matter. He said that he knew that the Emperor would react this way, since he has a tendency to want to do everything on his own. But still, he said that they might need her help until they develop new means. She looked at him and said with a smile that she understood everything. A moment later, a doctor came to them and asked where the Emperor was. He said he had prepared another medicine. She looked at the doctor and asked, what about the side effects? Ronnie was worried that the medicine could harm the Emperor. The doctor said he didn't think they would be, as he didn't add any poisonous herbs. He really hoped that the new medicine would work and help the Emperor. The doctor looked at them and asked if they could give the medicine to the Emperor. He looked at them and asked them to tell him if it worked. Yusil said that of course they will do everything and inform him. Ronnie said that she hoped everything would work out. It took them 2 days to find out if the new medicine worked. The Emperor shouted in rage to call a doctor immediately. She was shocked because she noticed that the new medicine did not work. Yusil looked at them and said that he would call the doctor. He told her it was time to leave. Ronnie stared at the Emperor. She knew that only she could help him now. She knew she shouldn't help since he said he didn't want to. But still, she knew that the medicine did not help. The Emperor told her to hurry up and leave immediately. He told her to run. The young lady came closer to him. He was in shock and did not understand why she was approaching him. He angrily shouted for her to leave as he didn't want to hurt her. She came closer to him and angrily told him that he couldn't handle it on his own. The Emperor was shocked because he did not expect her to do this. She looked at him and angrily asked how he was going to handle everything on his own. If his body became more resistant to the medicine, she said he knew she could help him. She asked him how he could reject her if he knew that she could help him. Ronaldina angrily shouted that he was an idiot. Ronaldina didn't understand why he was so stubborn. Ronaldina did it all for both of them. With lightning speed, she hugged him. Ronaldina knew that he had to kiss her before he fell into a stupor. It's not that she doesn't want it. She was shocked because she had just realized that she had called him an idiot. She didn't understand what to do now, because she insulted the Emperor. She didn't know if she should ask him for forgiveness. She hoped he had simply lost his head. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that he now understood how she perceived him. She sighed heavily and said that she meant something completely different. She said she just wanted to tell him that they were very worried about him. She said in a trembling voice that she didn't mean what she said. A moment later, she moved away from him and apologized for her rudeness. She said she would leave right away. She slowly turned around and wanted to leave. She was shocked because she realized that she had forgotten to give the emperor medicinal tea. A moment later, she came closer to him and told him that she had prepared tea with the extract for him. She said it would help with headaches. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had prepared tea for him. She said that the doctor checked all the ingredients and the tea should be effective. She said that with his permission, she would leave him. The emperor looked after her intently and laughed. Usiel brought tea to the emperor. The young man said that he was very glad that the tea was helping to relieve his symptoms. The emperor looked at him and asked if she had asked the delegation about this. He said Ronnie proposed to the doctor. The new medicine didn't help, but the tea seemed to be effective. The young man said that it was a pity that they couldn't tell Ronnie about this because she had a day off today. The emperor looked at him and told him to tell the delegation that they would like to buy it in bulk. The young man smiled and said that he had already done everything. The emperor looked at him intently. He remembered her saying that tea must be effective. He noticed that at one moment she was trembling with fear, and at the next she was full of confidence. The emperor was surprised that she was next to him. One day, he found her sleeping next to him. He remembered her asking him how he was going to cope with everything alone. The emperor is still not sure whether she was looking after him, or rather scolding him, but he still wondered how she managed to put him to sleep. The emperor looked at his friend and asked if he thought he was an idiot. The young man looked at the emperor in surprise. A moment later, he said with a smile that was exactly the case. He said few people understand. But it's true. Usiel looked at the emperor with a smile and asked who told him about this. She looked at the young ladies in surprise and asked if he really said that. The young lady smiled shyly and said he lowered his eyes and then said, she said embarrassedly that he said he was blinded by her beauty. She smiled and said that he said everything exactly like that. After tea, she received a new invitation. The tea party consisted of several ladies with whom she had already become friends. The young lady smiled and said she couldn't believe he confessed his love to her. She smiled and said that they had been dating ever since. There were only 5 of them, but they always managed to have a good time. There is another girl whom she considers a friend, like Mevin Illy Rothmill, was having a tea party today. Illy looked at Ronnie and asked if she was dating anyone. She said with a smile that it was impossible for gentlemen to leave such a beauty like her. The young lady sheepishly said that she was too busy with work to date anyone. She understood that it was a matter of survival. She was just happy to be alive. The young lady smiled and said that she had beaten all her competitors to become His Majesty's secretary. A moment later, she was asked how she felt about working with the emperor. Mevin said that Illy treats His Majesty with great respect. The other ladies said that it was disrespectful, since they all knew that she was in love with the emperor. The lady smiled and said that she understood why, since the emperor was perfect in everything. Ronnie was shocked because she realized that Illy had feelings for the emperor. Illy always talked about the emperor during their meetings. Ronnie felt sorry for her, since the emperor was destined to be with Celia. Usul smiled and told the emperor that he was showing signs of recovery, and it was all thanks to Ronnie. He said that he decided to conduct an experiment. He said that first, he would try to hold his arms and legs while he lost consciousness. The emperor looked at the young man in surprise and asked whether he considered him his emperor at all. The young man said that, first of all, we need to try something now. The emperor looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. Usiel said that it means that human touch is still unpleasant for him. The young man smiled and asked the emperor if a hug would be better now. The emperor angrily told him not to even dare think about such a thing. The emperor shouted at him to stop and not come near him. Usiel realized that it seemed that His Majesty did not like hugs either. He looked at the emperor and said that tomorrow they would invite assistance. The emperor looked closely at the young man and said that he definitely did not consider him to be his emperor. She was sitting at a tea party and having fun. She hoped that everything was in order in the palace. She entered the office and greeted them. She looked at the emperor in surprise as she saw that the situation was not very good. The emperor looked at her and said that the report she presented needed correction. He said he wanted her to redo it. She looked at the emperor and said that he would certainly do everything. She noticed that Lord Waidnett had brought His Majesty's personal staff and knights. She was surprised and didn't understand what he was trying to do. She understood that this could distract the emperor from what happened yesterday. Yusil approached her and asked with a smile if she had managed to get some rest. She said that she had rested, and also asked what was happening here. The young man looked at her and said that he forgot to tell her. He said they took her advice seriously and decided to try the experiment. She looked at him in surprise. He said that His Majesty still refuses to touch other people, so they are trying to find a way to make him feel comfortable. She looked at him in surprise and asked if they were really experimenting on His Highness like that. He smiled and said that was the only way to find out. He said that the knights here are the best of the best. His Majesty's maid and butler are also present. He smiled and said that his secret was safe with them. The emperor called his friend with rage. A moment later, the emperor said that he began to see black shadows. Everyone froze. The young man looked at everyone present and told everyone to stand in a row and hug His Majesty. The maid approached the emperor and said that she would put her hand on his shoulder. She was puzzled as he looked at her with a cold and angry look. The emperor said he could still see them. Konechna was a little shocked and didn't know what to do. The young man said that it turns out it doesn't work. Ronnie looked at him and asked if he knew it wouldn't work. He smiled and said that it was just his guess. She looked at him and asked if they really needed to do this. Ronnie said that even she could see that His Majesty didn't like it. He smiled and said that they wanted to see if this would make his hallucinations go away. He said he had to admit he was personally interested in this. He looked at her and asked if she wanted to try it. The young lady was surprised, since she was not particularly eager to approach the emperor. She had somehow forgotten that the young man could be quite persistent. Ronnie slowly walked towards the emperor. She looked at the emperor and said that she would take part in the experiment. She timidly said that it wouldn't take long. A moment later, she walked closer to the emperor and hugged him tenderly. She was shocked as she forgot for a moment. She should have approached him carefully and not immediately hugged him. She was sure that this was unpleasant for him. She wanted to let him go right away. But the emperor did not want to let her go. He was very surprised. Ronnie let go of the emperor, but he in turn took her hand. She looked at him in surprise. He looked at her in surprise and softly said that he was very interested in this, since the hallucinations had disappeared. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this meant he had overcome his trauma. He let go of her hand and said he didn't think so, since most likely it was only temporary. The emperor looked at everyone and said that the experiment was over and everyone could be free since he could not concentrate on work. She realized that he didn't seem to need her help. The young man looked at everyone and said that this would not work since he wanted them all to stay here for now. He said that they should do another experiment when His Majesty loses consciousness. The young lady was shocked because she realized that he was really something. Moments later, the young lady asked if a delegation from Ostanan had arrived. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was going to hit him now. She looked at him in surprise and said that she didn't know. Yusil said that because of the visit, their administrative meeting was rescheduled for the afternoon. Ronaldina was very happy about this. She looked at the young man and asked if they had come to discuss the Trigovan path. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew. Ronaldina looked at him and said with a smile that anyone would know, since the Empire does not have a normal trade route due to their orders. She said that guarding the Trigovan route would solve their problems. Avernus Empire is vast, but located on the eastern part of the continent. Ronaldina was surprised because she noticed that the young man was a skilled artist. Yusil said that other ways are dangerous and too expensive. But this path passes through the middle of the continent. If they can get to it, it will open up the possibility of expanding trade with other countries. He smiled and said that the Empire was great, but this would allow them to grow in other ways. She was surprised because it took courage to say this in front of His Majesty. Ronaldina understood that this would allow the main character to arrive safe and sound, and after which the main character will be able to cure His Majesty, and he looked at her and said that she would be in a good mood today. Ronaldina smiled and said that you could say that she said she knew someone from Ostanana. She thought about it and didn't know if the main character could immediately cure His Majesty. She understood that they were now in a novel, which meant that the main characters would need time to get to know each other. She knew she still needed money to build her dream shelter, so she has to work a little more. But still she thought about what happened. It seemed to her that everything was very strange since the story was ending, but nothing had happened yet. The Piffs have power, but cannot freely enter the royal palace. And the tea party consists of only a few people. She didn't know if everything would be okay. That night, Mevin said that Lady Rothmill had sent another letter to Ronaldine. Mevin told Ronaldina that she must have really liked her, because the young lady sent many letters. She slowly read the letter she wrote to Ronaldine that His Majesty's eyes shine brightly like the sun. She imagined Ronaldina's hair blowing in the cool wind. Ilya wrote that it had been 2 years since she last heard her voice. She wrote that she was looking forward to the excursion that had been promised to her. Ronnie was surprised as she had not promised to give her a tour. Mevin said that the letter had a small gift. Ronnie was surprised and wondered if the young lady was declaring her love for her. Mevin opened the box, and they saw beautiful earrings. She said that this must be the latest creation from Gilliwan's boutique. Mevin said that they would be perfect for her outfit for the upcoming banquet. Ronnie said the earrings were very beautiful. Ronnie also asked her friend if she thought that if she sent them back, the young lady would be very upset. She said that she was still very uncomfortable accepting such gifts. Yusil looked at the man and asked what he wanted to tell him. The man looked at them and said that he actually had something for the royal secretary. Ronnie was surprised. She wondered if Mevin had an important message for her. The man came closer to her and asked if she knew Lady Illy Rothmill. Ronnie said in surprise that she knew her. She also asked why he was asking this. He looked at her and said that the young lady was asking to meet her. Ronnie was surprised. She looked at the man and asked if he really wanted to say that the young lady was now in the palace. The man said that she was waiting for Ronnie in the living room. Ronaldina looked at the man and told him to tell her to wait a minute. But a moment later, the young lady burst into the office. Ilya turned to Ronaldina with a smile. Ronnie looked at the young lady and said that she should not go around here, and also asked her to talk in another place. Illy saw the emperor and turned to him with a smile. A moment later, she walked closer to the emperor and introduced herself. She said with a smile that she was honored to see him so close. She said that before this, she could only admire him from afar. Ronaldina was shocked. She walked closer to the young lady and asked her to go outside. But she in turn ignored her. Ronaldina was shocked as she noticed that the young lady was very strong. She couldn't even pull her away from the emperor. Illy said that she brought him a gift. She said with a smile that it was small, but she hoped he would like it. But a moment later, her path was blocked. The knight said that she needed to obtain permission to visit His Majesty. The young lady was furious. She screamed for them to force it and let her go, as she had already told them about it earlier. She screamed that Ronnie allowed her to come. Ronaldina was shocked. She was puzzled. She looked at the young lady and asked when she said such a thing. Illy looked at Ronnie and said that Ronnie had previously said that she would arrange a meeting for her with His Majesty. Ronnie looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she just said. Ronaldina looked at her and said that she never said that. Illy looked at her with tears in her eyes and said that she was a liar because she had deceived her. Illy said that she really enjoyed admiring His Majesty from afar. But Ronnie said that she could arrange a meeting for her with His Majesty. Yusil looked at the young lady in surprise. Illy just cried. Yusil came closer to Ronaldina and asked what was going on here. Ronaldina looked at everyone present and said that she herself would like to know this. The lady looked at her dumbfounded. A moment later, she said Ronnie said she could arrange a meeting with His Majesty for a fee, and she in turn sent her expensive gifts. Illy dropped the gift that was intended for the emperor. A moment later, she stepped on him. Illy said she sent her many gifts, including expensive necklaces. Illy shouted that Ronaldina took bribes. Yusil looked at her and asked if it was true. Ronnie looked at him in surprise and asked if he really believed her. He said that, of course, he didn't believe it. She's just so confident that he had to ask for it. Illy looked at the emperor and asked him to trust her. Illy said Ronnie offered to organize the meeting on her behalf, and she just came as she was told. Ronaldina was in shock. She did not understand whether the young lady was actually delusional, but still the young lady's words sounded very convincing. Ronnie wondered if maybe the young lady wasn't doing well, or she specifically approached her at the tea party. Ronaldina wondered if the young lady had befriended her so that she would let her guard down. She thought that both of these reasons were most likely involved. Illy said that Ronaldina did not deserve to be his secretary. A moment later, Ronnie laughed furiously. Everyone looked at her in surprise. Illy looked at her in surprise and asked if she had gone crazy. Ronnie looked at her and said that she returned all the gifts that she sent her. Illy said angrily that she was lying, since none of the gifts were returned to her. Ronnie said that the palace has records of all the things delivered and returned. Illy looked at them puzzled, and in a trembling voice asked if all the evidence was really there. Illy looked at the emperor and said that she was very sorry that his secretary turned out to be such a villain. She said he must take immediate action. The emperor looked at her intently. The young lady looked at the emperor and said in a trembling voice that she must be punished. UCL looked at the document and said that according to the records, Ronaldina had indeed sent several items recently. He said that once a month, they returned the items that had been delivered to the royal palace, and records show she sent several items 3 years ago. The young lady looked at them and said that it looked like she had simply falsified all the records. UCL looked at her and said that the records were sent to him as soon as the things left the palace, and there is simply no time to take notes. Ronnie said she sent everything back in the original packaging, and she can compare delivery records to see if she's telling the truth. The young lady said in a trembling voice that she knew for sure that nothing had been delivered to her estate. Ronnie looked at the young lady and said that she once asked her how long it took for things to return from the palace. Ronnie said she thought something was fishy and said it would take 2, when in fact it would take a week. Ronaldina looked at her and said that gifts were still on the way to her estate. The young lady was shocked. She said that this simply could not happen. The emperor looked at them and asked if they had finished their farce. The young lady bowed low and asked the emperor for forgiveness. She said she just wanted the chance to be in his presence. The emperor looked at the young lady and said that she should be brought to justice. The young lady was shocked. She shouted to the emperor that this was impossible and asked him to have mercy. She looked at the emperor and said that this was not her merit. The emperor was furious. He told her to stop and also asked if she was taking him for a fool. He looked at her with contempt and asked, how dare she try to start a conversation with him? The emperor looked at his friend and told him to review the documents. Illy looked intently at the emperor. She couldn't believe this was happening. Mevin looked at Ronnie and said that she had heard about what happened. As the whole palace was buzzing with news, Ronnie was shocked and asked if everyone really knew about what happened. Mevin said that they all knew that young Lady Illy tried to expose Ronaldina as a pathetic thief. She laughed and said that she was not a thief, but she knew that if she had not taken the necessary measures in time, she would have been fired and sent to prison. She looked at her and said that she understood, and thought that the young lady had ulterior motives. Ronnie looked at Mevin and asked her to wait a minute. She said that she could accept gifts from him and asked her to send them back with the rest of the gifts. Mevin was surprised, because a lot of effort was put into it. Ronnie said she felt uncomfortable accepting such luxury items. Mevin wished her good night. Ronnie wondered if she really did this because she wanted to meet the emperor. After all, she was just a commoner, and the young lady in turn comes from a prestigious, noble family. She didn't understand why the young lady took so much risk. Ronnie knew she had to be careful, because you never know what might happen. If only she had not listened to her friend's advice then she would have been dragged through the courts. Ronaldina did not understand why the young ladies needed to set her up. She still hoped that no one had instigated the young lady. Ronaldina, I sat thinking about everything. Uciel came closer to her and said that Lady Roatmill was already being given trial in prison. Ronaldina looked at him puzzled, but did not answer. A moment later, she asked if he knew what would happen to her. He smiled and said he didn't know. He said that the Soda would give the verdict as soon as he makes a decision. He said that her parents asked for an audience with the emperor and begged for conversion. But he didn't think this would happen. He said that the emperor may not say it, but he valued Ronnie very highly. She looked at him and asked how often this happens. The young man thought for a moment. He said bribery exists wherever she goes. Walking along the corridor, they saw the maids. Ronnie said she looked like Illy thought she could get away with it because Ronnie is a commoner. He looked at her and said that perhaps it was so. He smiled and said that she was still great. A moment later, they heard a crash. Ronaldina looked at Lord Wadenet in surprise and shock and asked if everything was okay with him. The young lady was surprised. She saw Lord Clarat. The Lord looked at them and said that he needed their help. He said the Ostanan delegation arrived a month ahead of schedule. Ronnie ran into the office screaming. She looked closely at the Emperor. The Emperor was surprised by her behavior. She looked at the Emperor and said that the delegation had arrived ahead of schedule. The Emperor looked at her in surprise and dumbfounded. The Emperor looked at her and asked if they weren't supposed to come next month. She looked at him and said that it was exactly like that, and they had no time to prepare for their visit. She looked at the Emperor and said that the lords had gone to meet them in the reception room. The Emperor was shocked. The Emperor looked at the maid and she bowed and left the room. The young lady realized that the maid had to go get his formal attire. She looked at the Emperor and said that she would wait for him in his office. Ronnie stood near the office and waited for the Emperor. She knew that things were very hectic in the palace right now. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at her. But still, she knew that she needed to pull herself together. A moment later, she heard the sound of a door opening. The young lady looked at the Emperor in surprise. The Emperor looked at her and asked where their delegation was waiting. A moment later, they walked leisurely into the reception room. She knew that the two main characters would finally meet. Ronaldina wondered if this meant the story was really starting to unfold. She knew that the story had deviated significantly from the original plot. She hoped that everything would return to normal. If their relationship doesn't progress, she'll have to push it a little. She didn't remember the details, but the sooner they started a relationship, the easier it would be for her. The lords greeted the Emperor with a smile. The Emperor looked at the delegation and said that they had come a long way. The young lady smiled and said that it was not like that at all. She said with a smile that they traveled in comfort thanks to the carriage and knights that the Emperor sent them. The young lady greeted the Emperor, and she introduced herself. She said her name was Celia Trumine. Celia asked the Emperor if he wanted to use the Trigovan route. They began to discuss possible trade between the two countries. Without looking up from the documents, the Emperor said that everything was correct. Ronaldina noticed that the atmosphere was so prodigal that one could cut the tension with a knife. Celia looked at the Emperor and said that indefinitely was not a word to be taken lightly. The Emperor said that their empire would pay them well for the rights. They did not know how the trade route would develop in the future. Ronnie silently followed the negotiations. Celia said she personally believes it will become even more valuable, so given this, the value of the path is likely to increase. Therefore, she is not sure that the price they agreed on now will be fair in the future. Ronaldina looked at the young lady in surprise. The Emperor looked at her and said that the trade route had its merits, but she seemed to overestimate its value. He said that their empire could always find a new passage if they put in the effort. She looked at him and said that his empire was surrounded by the highest and mightiest mountains on the continent. She said she was very curious about how he planned to pave the road. She said that through the mountainous terrain, it would be difficult for Ostanan, but for Avern, it would be a piece of cake. Everyone present was shocked as they realized that the Emperor had just mocked Ostanan in the presence of their own princess. They could no longer rule with an iron fist. They lived at the airport when countries were establishing trade for maximum benefit. Ronnie was in shock and did not understand the Emperor. She was sure that the lords also did not understand his words. She knew that, of course, after their discussion, there would be chemistry between them. The young lady looked at the Emperor and said that she did not expect the negotiations to go well, because they knew that this was a big request on their part. Ronnie noticed that the princess did not seem to be afraid of the Emperor at all. Most people who met his menacing and cold gaze would run away screaming. The princess looked at the Emperor and said that at the moment alone, they could not satisfy their request. She asked forgiveness for her rudeness. She hoped that they could continue to negotiate during their interruption here. The princess said she was sure they could come to some kind of agreement. The Emperor did not answer her. Ronnie knew that the Emperor was not one to fall in love at first sight. The Lord looked at the princess and asked her permission to escort her to her chambers. The young princess said goodbye to the Emperor with a smile. Ronnie forgot that her colleague was busy at the upcoming banquet for the Emperor's birthday. She knew that the Emperor was not at all interested in celebrating his birthday, but she didn't want to have a banquet again. A moment later, the messenger said that a princess had come to see the Emperor. The Emperor looked at him and said that he could let her in. Ronnie was waiting for the princess to arrive. She was surprised that she decided to come to the Emperor. Entering the office, the princess smiled and thanked the Emperor for receiving her today. Ronnie saw the main character in all her glory. Ronnie realized that she needed to leave them alone. She looked at the Emperor and said that she needed to check on something about the Emperor's birthday banquet and would be back soon. The Emperor looked at the princess and said that she could sit down. Ronnie slowly left the office. The princess looked at the Emperor and said that she was very glad that he agreed to meet with her today. Ronnie thought that everything was fine with them from the very beginning, but later she realized that she was wrong. UCL looked at the Emperor and said that he could not continue to be rude to the princess. The Emperor told him to calm down and not say anything more. After UCL scolded the Emperor did his best to treat the princess with respect. The princess told the Emperor that she would like to continue the previous conversation. The princess's visits to the Emperor became more and more frequent. She looked at the Emperor and said that for these reasons, she believed that it would be unfair to them, and so she wanted to change some details, because it was believed that perhaps they would find a solution. The Emperor looked at the princess and said that he only wanted her to visit him once a week at the appointed time and day. The princess looked at the Emperor in surprise, as she did not expect him to tell her something like that. The Emperor said that otherwise the negotiations would stop. He looked at her and said he hoped he made himself clear. The princess was shocked by this conversation. Uciel looked at the princess and said with a smile that His Majesty wished only the best for her. Ronnie saw how difficult it was for the Emperor to communicate with the princess. Ronnie realized that the princess was definitely interested in His Majesty. She was very surprised by the whole situation. Ronnie knew she had to leave them alone as much as possible, but she was puzzled because she didn't hear anything. Ronnie was surprised at herself that she tried to open the door to listen to their conversation. Ronaldina understood that if she entered, she could interfere with them. Ronnie knew she had to pull herself together immediately, because she knew that their story was very important. A moment later, Ronnie saw Usual, she called him. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing here. Ronaldina looked at him intently and smiled. She didn't know how to answer his question. He sighed heavily. A moment later, he asked her if it was all because of the princess. The young lady was surprised and puzzled as she realized that he was catching on quickly. Ronnie understood that the young man already knew that she had come up with a reason to leave His Majesty and the crown princess alone. She hoped he wouldn't ask her why she did it. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she wanted to look around while she was there. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she wouldn't bother him. He smiled and said that since she was here, she might as well look around. She was puzzled as he sometimes got on her nerves. She knew she had to show restraint and not hit him. She looked at him and said that the banquet was just around the corner. Ronnie asked how things were going with him. Uciel smiled and said that not everything is perfect, but everything goes as usual. He looked at her and said that this would be the first official banquet in honor of His Majesty's birthday. Since he became Emperor, Ronnie was surprised. He said that's why he's working with other officials to make it special. She said that she knew about the Radish banquet, but did not realize that His Majesty was not interested in his own birthday. He said that the Emperor always told them that this was not a priority, so they humbly did not contradict him. But thanks to her, they will finally be able to throw a magnificent party. She looked at him and said with a smile that she had simply told the Emperor earlier that the banquet would also contribute to the growth of the empire. The young man said that yet the Emperor did not listen to him when he said the same thing. He looked at her and asked if His Majesty had taken his medicine today. She looked at him and said that he took his medicine this morning, and after that, he drank some tea. The young man smiled and said that he was very glad to hear this. The young lady was wondering whether the main character would intervene if His Majesty fell unconscious. Since she had previously read in the novel that they would hug or take things to the next level, she was shocked to imagine them together. She didn't understand why she felt so hurt and uncomfortable imagining them together. The young man looked at her and called. He asked if she was okay and noticed that she looked very pale. Uciel was very worried about her. The young lady smiled and said she was fine. Ronaldina could not tell him the true reason for her worries. She knew that in general, everything was not all right with her. She didn't understand why she was so worried. She hoped it was just mood swings, and soon everything will pass, and everything will be as before with her. Ronnie stared at the Emperor. The Emperor caught her gaze and looked at her in surprise. She was surprised and puzzled because she didn't understand why he was looking at her like that. She thought that he had noticed that lately she had been feeling a little awkward around him, but still she knew that he shouldn't look at her like that. She looked at him and asked for forgiveness. She didn't understand why there was such a tense atmosphere in the office, and because of this, she felt uneasy. She looked at the Emperor and asked if he wanted something from her. The Emperor stood up and slowly approached her. The Emperor walked up to her and looked at her intently. Ronnie was surprised. She looked at the Emperor and saw that he felt bad. She was surprised and didn't understand why Ronnie asked the Emperor if the effect of the tea had already worn off. She asked if there was any way she could help him. The Emperor, without looking at her, told her to leave, as he did not want to hurt her. He told her to quickly leave the office. Ronnie smiled and hugged him. She said tenderly that everything would be fine. She didn't know why, but she was no longer afraid of him. She wanted to be useful, at least for a moment. Ronnie knew that she would soon be replaced by the main character. But until then, she could not leave the Emperor alone with his problem. She wondered if it was because she got to know him better. She didn't know if this was true, or if she just felt compassion for the man who stood in front of her. She looked at him and said with pity that she was very sorry that she could only relieve the pain for a while. But the only problem was that she was starting to feel a little awkward every time this happened. But she still hoped that she managed to calm him down and help him. She understood that everything was not bad, and everything seemed to go well. She was sure he would pass out, and she would have to move him to safety again. The Emperor looked at her and asked if she had really helped him out again. Ronnie was shocked because she didn't understand what was happening. She was very glad that he calmed down. But I was stunned that he remembered everything. She wondered if he had woken up in time for their kiss. Ronnie understood that this was not good at all. The Emperor took her hand and thanked her with a smile. Ronaldina was shocked because she wanted to get out of here as quickly as possible. The guests walked around and discussed the decorations for the banquet. They said with a smile that it was like a banquet on the occasion of the Emperor's birthday. Ronnie looked at everyone intently. The young people said that there would be a lot to do during the celebration. The ladies smiled and said that they all looked very excited. They saw the head of the delegation. Everyone was surprised, as there were many new faces at the banquet this year. Ronnie knew that His Majesty would appear any minute. She expected him to arrive soon. She still couldn't get that moment out of her head, when he thanked her for her help. But it seemed to her that His Majesty did not care. But in turn, it was not easy for her to be around him. She felt awkward. Verica came closer to Ronaldina and asked with a grin if this was an accident from the Imperial Secretary. Verica said that Ronaldina is dressed very smartly today. Verica said with a grin that it wasn't like anyone appreciated it. Verica said with a grin that she would always be a commoner, no matter how she dressed. Ronnie was very angry because she did not understand why the young lady approached her and what she was even talking about. Ronnie looked at her and said that the rumors were going away, that she appeared whenever His Majesty gave official performances. Ronnie said she didn't think that was true. Ronnie said that she was very sorry that Verica did not get this job. Otherwise, she could have been next to him all day long. Verica was shocked by what Ronaldina told her. She didn't expect this at all. Verica said that she was very sorry, but if everything had gone according to plan, Ronaldina would now be in prison. But here she stands here and talks incessantly. Ronnie was shocked by what she heard. Since she now realized who was involved in everything, what happened to her lately, Ronnie realized that it all started at the tea party. Ronnie was a little shocked as she had just realized this. Ronaldina looked at the young lady and asked if she was the one egging her on. Verica looked at the young lady with a grin and asked what she meant by egging her on, and she used a slotted spoon to say that she had no idea what the young lady was talking about, since she simply gave her some advice, since they both treated the Emperor with the deepest respect. The young lady said that as far as she knew, Illy said that only the butler helped her. She looked at Ronnie and said with a smirk that that meant she couldn't drag her into this. She said that she was very sorry that everything was not as Ronaldina had imagined. Ronnie looked at the young lady with contempt. She was very angry that things turned out this way. One of the young ladies approached Verica and asked what happened. Ronaldina sighed heavily and said that they were all somehow strange, but she still finds it quite interesting. She said that it was very interesting to her that such noble ladies as they perceived her commoner as a threat. Ronnie said that if she were them, she wouldn't even pay attention to it. She looked at them and said that if they were acting like this, then she must be a big threat. The young ladies were shocked by what she said. Ronnie was very glad that she answered them like that, because she knew that, thank God, she was not going to be involved in high society for long. Verica S. said that she could say the same about her. Verica said with a grin that she was a simple commoner, and no one would even consider her as the Emperor's wife. Verica said with a grin that Ronnie can wear fashionable dresses as much as she wants, but His Majesty will not pay her even a drop of attention. Ronnie would have liked to say something else, but they had already begun to greet His Majesty. Verica finally told her, with a grin, that she was pathetic. Ronnie didn't say anything and just looked at the Emperor. She never wanted this, because she understood and knew who he would marry in the end. The Emperor looked at the young lady in surprise. Ronnie, in turn, stood with a depressed expression on her face. Ronnie knew she had nothing to do with it. She knew that she would soon leave the palace. The young people slowly greeted the Emperor. Ronnie knew that now that the Emperor was here, she should stand next to His Majesty, but she did not want to do this at all. She knew she needed to forget about everything and deal with the consequences later. The man approached the young lady and asked how she had been lately. Ronnie looked at him and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. She said that she had a presentiment that she would definitely see him today. Ronnie said she was fine. She looked at him and asked, "How are you doing in the dukedom?" She also asked if Zero was doing a good job. The Duke smiled and told her to hold her horses a little, as he would answer all her questions in turn. The Duke smiled and said that his trading company was doing very well. Ronnie smiled and said that she was very glad to hear that he was able to establish a connection with the guild. She said with a smile that it would definitely benefit his business. The Duke looked at her and said with a smile that he was very happy that she had become His Majesty's private secretary. The Duke said that the Emperor went through a lot at a young age, but paved the way to conquer his empire. The Duke with a smile asked her to take care of the Emperor. Ronnie looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. Usiel interrupted their conversation as he came closer to them, and with a smile told the Duke that they had not seen each other for a long time. The Duke smiled and greeted the young man. He said with a smile that he was very cute as a child, but grew into a handsome young man. The Duke said that he would like to have a daughter of the same age. The young man smiled and said that the Duke thought too highly of him. He said that he would like to talk to Ronnie's. The Duke smiled and dismissed them. The Duke said goodbye to them with a smile, and also told Ronnie that he hoped they would see each other again soon. Ronnie looked at him and asked if he had come for her because he thought she was idle now. He smiled and said that everything was not like that at all, since he also knew that she needed communication. He asked her forgiveness and said that His Majesty had urgently summoned her. Ronnie looked at him and said with a smile that he shouldn't ask for forgiveness. Ronnie was surprised because she saw the princess next to the head of the delegation. She was surprised, did not understand why they were together now. Usiel looked at the Emperor and asked if everything was okay with him. The Emperor said he just had a headache and nothing out of the ordinary. Usiel looked at the Emperor and said with a smile that he would now ask the employees to bring him tea. Ronnie mentally asked her friend not to leave her alone with the Emperor. The Emperor looked at her and said that she should work and not gossip. Ronnie was surprised because she did not expect to hear something like that. She looked at the Emperor and said that Usiel was with him. The Emperor said that last time she was also asleep. He looked at her and asked if she had become a slob. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him and asked if his head hurt much. The Emperor said that the noise made it worse, but still, it was nothing to worry about, and he could handle it. She asked if he wanted to hold her hand until Usiel arrived. The Emperor said that everyone here would be shocked to see them holding hands. No matter how they play, tongues will wag. He looked at her and told her that she should take care of herself. He said she was his only secretary. Usiel looked at the Emperor and asked with a smile if he would order the food and wine to be taken away. The young lady looked in surprise at the food that was near the Emperor. She thought they were going to throw it away. She thought it was very wasteful of them. The Emperor looked at her in surprise. The Emperor looked at the man and told him to bring dessert. The man cut a piece of cake. Ronnie was surprised because she did not expect the Emperor to eat dessert with tea. She thought that His Majesty and a sweet dessert sounded very contradictory. The emperor looked at her and asked if she would like to have dessert. She looked at him in surprise and said that everything was fine. She was surprised and did not understand what had happened to the emperor. Ronaldina looked at him in surprise because she did not understand why he was acting so strangely. Since he had almost never addressed her before, she thought that she soon felt better after tea. Yusil looked at her and asked why she didn't try dessert. She looked at them and said it was okay, since she doesn't like desserts. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. He said with a smile that it was very tasty. The emperor looked at him and asked if he wasn't tired of sweets. The emperor said that the young man was struggling to lose weight. Yusil looked at the emperor in surprise and asked how he could be so cruel. He said that he allows himself sweets only at banquets, and he is unlikely to recover. The emperor looked at him and asked if he was joking. The emperor looked at him in surprise and asked where all the cake had gone. Rani looked at them with a smile. She knew she couldn't laugh. The emperor looked at the young man and said that he would like Rani to eat the dessert and not him. Rani smiled because she didn't expect to hear this. A moment later, they were greeted by the princess. The princess said with a smile that she wanted to wish him a happy birthday. She said with a smile that she was honored to be with him today. She looked at him and asked if he had made his decision yet. The young people whispered, because they didn't know who she really was. They wondered if they had anything to discuss. Ronaldina knew they still had to take it to the next level, but still she did not expect that the princess herself would take the initiative. But still she was surprised and did not understand why she felt so sick. It is very difficult to follow their conversation. Yusil looked at her and asked if she was okay. She looked at them and asked for forgiveness, saying that she was not feeling well right now. She wanted to go out for a while to get some fresh air. A moment later, she came out onto the terrace. She wondered if her bra was too tight. She was sure that this was not so because her maid took her measurements. She thought that most likely she was feeling unwell because of something else. She knew that from that moment on, everything would change dramatically. She was wondering when the main character would start treating His Majesty. She never would have thought that sitting and waiting would be such a difficult task. She wondered if she felt this way because she was worried about the future. She wanted the main character to just cure him. She also wanted them to be close. She knew she had to get back to her job. The young lady slowly returned to the hall. Entering the hall, she was surprised because she did not understand where everyone had gone. She wondered if she had to wait for them to return. She noticed the butler running. She was surprised. She knew that they did not use that room during banquets, since it was connected to the living room. Rani wondered if something had happened while she was gone. The princess slowly entered the office. Rani looked at the princess in surprise and shock and asked what she was doing here. Rani was dumbfounded, because I saw a truly terrible picture. She saw the emperor lying on the ground. With the speed of lightning, she rushed towards him. She looked at them and asked how long ago this happened. The young man said that the emperor took the medicine in the morning, and the butler immediately went for the doctor. Rani was surprised, because she realized that everything was happening too quickly. But she was more surprised that the princess did not come to his aid. Rani looked at the princess and said that she would explain everything to her later. She hoped that the princess would keep everything a secret. She looked at them. Rani came closer to her and said that, for the sake of their diplomatic relations, everything must be kept secret. Ronaldina politely asked the princess to leave. Rani came closer to the lord and told him to wait a little. The emperor said that this was enough. Ronaldina looked at the emperor and asked him to try to concentrate. The emperor was furious, he shouted. The young lady looked at the emperor and asked him not to blame himself. She was in shock and did not understand what he had gone through as a child. She understood that it hurt not only for him, but also for those around him in his environment. She understood that his pain would only make her worse. Yusil looked at everything that was happening in surprise. The young man looked at her in surprise and called. He was dumbfounded by everything that was happening. The young man looked at them and asked if everything was okay. Yusil looked at her and said that His Majesty had fallen asleep so she could calm down and stop crying. Rani looked at him in surprise and said that she did not cry. The young man said that in any case, things were not going well. Since the secret became clear, because the princess witnessed everything, he didn't understand how they could explain all this to her now. Ronaldina knew that the princess she knew after reading the novella would not blackmail the emperor with what she saw. Ronnie looked at him and asked permission to speak to the princess herself, because she knew that she needed to be convinced that she was right. She didn't remember all the details in the story. She remembered only certain moments from different parts of the book. However, she remembered the key plot points in the novella. She knew that the plot had deviated from the original. And this was what made her worry. This meant that not only she, but also His Majesty, had changed their destiny. She understood that because of this, they would continue to suffer. Ronnie looked at the princess and thanked her for agreeing to come. The princess smiled and said that there was no need for that, because she had some questions. The princess thanked her for being invited. Ronnie looked at the princess and said that they had met before. She introduced herself and said that she was the emperor's personal secretary. The princess smiled and said that she remembered her. The princess also introduced herself again. Ronnie looked at the butler. A moment later, the butler left them alone. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked if His Majesty was suffering from some kind of illness. Ronaldina looked at her and asked if she had witnessed this. The princess said that she was there from the moment he became unwell until the moment she closed the door on her. Ronnie knew that if she kept going around like this, the princess would never reveal her true intentions. She could only imagine what her reaction would be based on what she learned about her from the novel. Ronnie wanted the princess to take pity on His Majesty, so that next time she would rush to his aid. Ronnie looked at the princess and said that the emperor had a mental disorder, and that's why the princess caught him at such an inopportune moment. She remembered her friend asking if she thought the princess would understand. Ronnie said they had no other choice. Ronnie said that if everything was explained properly, it should not affect the ongoing negotiations. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked if it was possible to find out what kind of injury he was suffering from. The princess said that she need not answer such a question, because she simply couldn't imagine it. The princess said that it must have been difficult for the emperor to talk to her, and she should have been more careful. Ronnie was surprised, because she hadn't even started to say anything yet. The princess looked at her and said that she promised not to talk about it, so she didn't need to worry about something like that. The princess slowly approached the young lady. The princess took out a thread from her dress. She asked her forgiveness with a smile, since she could not stand this. Ronnie looked at the princess in surprise and dumbfounded. She thanked her. The princess looked at her and said that she would immediately talk to the emperor when he felt better. Ronnie was surprised, since she didn't even explain everything that was happening. She wondered if everything would be fine in the future. Ronnie wondered if she needed to resort to extreme measures to bring them together. But still, she knew that she shouldn't overdo it. Sometime later, she was again at the banquet. The young lady was puzzled, as she had a lot of work to do and still needed to report to UCL. It was the second day of the festive banquet. Ronnie was surprised since the hall was still crowded. She noticed that the emperor was sitting on the throne. She supposed he must be feeling better now that he's back. Ronaldina understood that she needed to be near him. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. The young ladies came closer to her. They asked if she was busy now. Ronnie looked at them and said that everything was fine, and she had some time. They looked at her and asked with a smile if she was okay. They wondered if Illy had done her any harm. Ronnie looked at them in surprise and said that everything was fine. They didn't understand how she could even do this. They wondered if the young lady had ulterior motives all along. Ronnie smiled and said everything was fine. The young lady came closer to the armor and said that she heard something interesting. She heard it said that Lady Piff was behind it all. Ronnie was surprised because she did not expect to hear something like this. The young ladies said, puzzled, that this was not the first time she had used others for her own personal revenge. They said that she must have had something against Ronaldina and Illy and was trying to get rid of them both in one fell swoop. They looked at her and told her that if the rumors were true, then she needed to be more careful, since it will not be established in pursuit of what it wants. Ronnie knew, looking at the young ladies, that this was really happening for them. Ronnie knew she was right. Ronaldina understood that Verika would stop at nothing. Ronnie understood that soon the main character would be in danger. The young lady looked at Ronaldina and asked if she was sick. Ronaldina said that everything is not so simple. She is up to her ears with work. The lovely ladies smiled and said that they had taken up too much of her time. They wanted to meet again, to talk in a more pleasant environment. Ronnie wondered and wondered When Verica started acting against Celia in the novel, Ronnie knew that the princess almost died while leaving the festival, but she was guessing and didn't understand where such an oversight came from. She knew she needed to remember more, because something else happened at that tea party. Ronaldina shuddered. The young man came closer to her and asked if she was okay. She smiled and said she was fine, and thanked him. He smiled and said that she should thank His Majesty because he asked her to help. The emperor looked at him and asked where his tea was. Usul said with a smile that he had forgotten about it, but he would now ask the butler to bring it. The emperor looked at the young lady and asked what was on her mind. He said she should be more aware of her surroundings. She looked at him and said that this was nonsense, and thanks to him, she managed to avoid injury. He looked at her and said that it was true, and she should definitely be grateful. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She was in shock and did not understand what was happening. The emperor looked at her and told her to be with the guards from now on. The young lady said that she spoke with the princess, and she in turn swore to keep everything secret. Ronnie said it took a weight off Usul's shoulders, because she saw that he was terribly worried. Ronnie smiled and said she was sure he would feel relieved. The emperor looked at her in surprise and called. A moment later, he asked if she was worried about Uchiel. She slowly sorted out the documents. Ronnie got up from the ground. Her back hurt very much. The Lord looked at her and said that he understood that she was too busy. He came closer to her and said that it was too cluttered, even for her. He asked her if she could tell which was which. The Lord said, puzzled, that to some extent he thanked them for their help. Usul said that they came because they did not cope and did not send them the report on time. He wanted to quickly get everything in order. Ronaldina remembered the emperor. She understood that they all had to do a lot for the princess. Verica felt the princess's presence during the first day of the banquet. Ronnie was sure that she was lying low, but she didn't know when the villain would return. A moment later, someone called her. The knight looked at her and told her to take other documents. She looked at him and said that she would definitely do so. Usul looked at everyone present and said with a smile that they could take the day off tomorrow, since His Majesty had no business planned. The young people were very happy. Usul looked at her and said with a smile that he should have told her in advance. She smiled and said that she would be happy to take the day off. Usul looked outside the window and said that the air was very humid and I felt like it would rain tomorrow. She looked at him and asked with a smile if he was part frog. He smiled and said that, of course not. Ronnie looked out the window and was very surprised because it started to rain. She didn't like the sound of the rain. She thought she should still go for a walk. She wanted to walk to places she didn't know. She was walking, and everything seemed very strange to her, because earlier her friend said that His Majesty was free today. She entered the office and was very surprised. She looked closely, but the emperor. She was very surprised that it worked. Ronnie looked at him closely, as it seemed to her that something was wrong here. She saw that he was not feeling very well. A moment later, she noticed that he was not feeling well. She thought that he was most likely suffering from nightmares again. She came closer to him and hugged him. Ronnie really hoped that he would feel better soon. She saw the color return to his cheeks. She was very happy, and it was a relief for her. A moment later, the emperor woke up and looked at the young lady in surprise. She looked at him and asked if he was okay. He was surprised and did not understand when she even came to him. The young lady looked at him and said that he should not exhaust himself at all. She said his friend was very worried about him. Ronnie told the emperor that the Lord told her that he hasn't been sleeping at night lately, and that the emperor skips meals. The emperor looked at her and said with a smile that he had always been like this. The emperor said that they first met when Avernus was still a kingdom. Then his father brought him to the palace to keep him company. The young man followed him everywhere, and they often argued about it. The emperor said with a smile that sometimes he teased him. The emperor said that they got into various minor troubles together. The emperor recalled past times with a smile. She looked at him and said with a smile that it was difficult for her to imagine how the emperor and the Lord got into trouble together. The emperor looked at her in surprise. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she noticed that he was holding her hand. She realized that he didn't seem to mind physical contact with people anymore. The young lady walked leisurely along the corridor. Ronnie knew they needed to increase their budget to renovate the palace. She had several questions, but the Lord went out somewhere. The emperor looked at her and asked where she was going. Ronnie looked sideways at him and said that she was heading to the office. Entering Ronnie's office, I saw the Lord. She asked in surprise if it was him. The Lord looked at her and asked if it was really looking for something. Ronnie said she was looking for him, since she needs to look at last year's expenses for repairs. He said with a smile that they had repaired a lot of things last year, that he was even lost in everything. He said that he would certainly find everything now. The Lord looked at her and said that he did not have time today to visit His Majesty. He asked her how he was doing. She looked at him and said that everything seemed to be all right with the Emperor. She looked at him in surprise and asked what happened. The Lord said he didn't tell her why he gave everyone the buzz yesterday. The Lord said that yesterday was the day of the death of His Majesty's mother. The Emperor always had a hard time on this day, and during this period, his seizures occur more often than usual. The Lord said that the Emperor needs to consume a double dose of medicine. He said he was surprised at how quickly this year went by. He said that he did not see the necessary documents for this. He would bring them later. The young lady looked at him and said that she would wait. She said that in that case, she would go. Ronnie noticed that tears were flowing involuntarily. The Lord looked at her and told her not to run, as she might trip and fall. She was in shock and did not understand why she became so emotional when it came to His Majesty. She ran along the corridor and noticed that the door to the office was open. The young lady wondered if she had forgotten to close the door. A moment later, she saw the princess hugging the Emperor. Ronnie was shocked. Uciel looked at the Emperor in surprise and called him. Ronnie closed the door. A moment later, she heard a crash. She turned around and saw the Emperor. He looked at her and told her to stop avoiding him. Ronnie looked closely at the Emperor. She was in shock. She did not understand why the princess was next to him. Ronaldina was shocked and wondered why this had already started. Ronnie was shocked because she understood that it was too early to treat the Emperor. She was shocked and didn't understand why it surprised her so much. She thought that, most likely, she was simply in love with the Emperor. Ronnie remembered the moment when the princess left without a fight. But in fact, at that moment, she felt relieved. Ronnie froze in surprise. She was shaking very much. Mevin looked at her and said with a smile that she had come too early. Mevin looked at her in surprise and asked what happened. Ronnie said she just wasn't feeling well. Ronnie said that she would like to be alone. Mevin looked at her and said that she should still lie down. Ronnie was in shock. She was shaking and crying. Mevin looked at her and said that she would feel better. Soon Mevin will tell the others that she is not feeling well. She said the others wouldn't drag her out of bed. Ronnie smiled and said that she didn't think they would do that. Mevin said she sleeps better when she puts her thoughts in order. She looked at her and said with a smile that they knew they were bothering her so much. Mevin smiled and told her to remember that she would always be on her side. Ronnie thought that most likely she was just confused. She didn't understand how anyone could fall in love with a man who tried to kill her. From the very beginning, she was shocked by her own actions. Now she understood why she had been so upset when His Majesty refused to hold her hand. She understood that you still couldn't go against fate. She was sure that one day she would be able to cope with her feelings. The young boy came closer to her and called her. She looked at him in surprise. She had a dream. She wanted to quit when she had enough money to realize her dream. She wanted to start work immediately tomorrow. She wanted to keep her distance. Ronnie knew she needed to avoid the Emperor at all costs. The Emperor had already reread the same sentence several times. He didn't understand why he tolerated Ronnie's touch. He was starting to imagine something, and he felt uneasy. He thought that he probably often worked at night. The Emperor heard that someone had left. He thought it was her. He knew he just needed to open his eyes. He felt someone's touch. The Emperor felt uneasy. He knew that Ronnie had a calm, woody scent. A moment later, the Emperor smelled a floral, disgusting smell. Opening his eyes, he looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she was doing now. For a moment, it seemed to him that Ronnie was standing in front of him. But a moment later, he clearly saw the princess in front of him. The princess, puzzled, asked forgiveness for touching him. She said she noticed he had something in his hair. The Emperor looked at her with fury and asked who gave her the right to touch a sleeping person. He said she didn't even knock on the door. The princess said that her escort had left because work had come up and she was already tired of waiting for him. She said in a trembling voice that she was wrong. The Emperor remembered how his friend asked him to be kinder to the princess. The Emperor said that she may have heard earlier that he was not yet in a position to conduct any negotiations. He politely asked her to come at another time. The princess looked at him and said that in that case, she would leave. The emperor was shocked as he realized that he was waiting for Rani. He wondered if he just wanted to take advantage of her powers to stop his hallucinations. The lord approached the emperor and said that he looked very pale. The emperor looked at him and asked when he had arrived. He said that he had just arrived and thought that he was very lost in his thoughts. Yushal said that Rani will not work for now because she's not feeling well right now. The emperor was surprised. The emperor said angrily that he was getting on his nerves. The lord looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really talking about him now. The emperor looked at the documents. The emperor wanted to avoid her at all costs. Rani approached the lord and asked why it was taking so long to build waterways in this region. The lord looked at her and told her to ask the emperor, since he had been thinking about this for a long time. The young lady, puzzled, said that she understood everything. She said she would deal with it herself. The young people were shocked by her answer. They didn't expect this. The emperor was shocked because he realized what. And again, she took up her task. This happened when she started work. And when I brought him the documents, the emperor was surprised, since she had previously explained everything to him personally. Now she's taking notes. Whenever the emperor asked her to make adjustments to the documents, she asked for forgiveness and said that she needed to check the report received from the foreign secretary, so she asked him to ask the lord. The lord looked at the emperor in surprise and asked what he had done, since such behavior was unusual for her. The emperor blocked her path. Rani looked at him in surprise and said that she had urgent matters to take care of. The young lady screamed. The emperor looked at her in surprise and puzzlement. He asked if she had just screamed. She saw that there was a lord nearby. He looked at them as he wanted to leave them alone. She was surprised, looked at the lord, and told him not to leave. She said it wasn't what he was thinking. A moment later, the emperor turned around gloomily and left. The lord looked at her and asked, "What happened?" Lor said that he felt as if the emperor was in a bad mood. Right now, Rani looked at him and said she didn't know. She saw that the emperor looked at her angrily. She looked at the lord and asked, "Why not come in?" Rani said she needed to take care of something. He smiled and said that of course he would come. The emperor looked at his friend in surprise and said that she had just screamed. He looked at him and asked if he was really that scary. The lord looked at the emperor and said that he was a little scary. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that the emperor was very close. The young lady was shocked as she realized that the emperor already knew that she was avoiding him, but it knew that they would not go back to the way things were before. She thought he would fire her for her unprofessionalism. Ronaldina knew she had to earn more money to achieve her goal. She knew that, even now, she had to keep distance between them. She knew it would be easier to hide what she was thinking about him. She was coming back. A moment later, she saw the princess. Rani knew that the princess had a visit to the emperor today. She knew she had to leave them alone. Rani knew it would be easier for everyone. A moment later, she heard a loud crash. Rani was very scared. She burst into the office with lightning speed. Rani saw the princess sitting on the ground. Rani looked at the emperor and told the servants that she would be with the emperor, and she also asked to call the lord. Rani called the princess. A moment later, she pushed the emperor. The emperor fell. Rani looked at him and asked if he was okay. The princess trembled with fear while sitting on the floor. Rani came closer to the princess and said that everything was fine. She asked her to calm down as help was on the way. Rani smiled and told the princess to breathe slowly with her. The princess looked at her in surprise while she cried. Rani heard the emperor sigh heavily. She rushed to the emperor. She called him. A moment later, she came closer to him and hugged him. Ronaldina consoled him and told him that everything would be fine. She said that there was nothing to worry about. She asked him not to be afraid. She was shocked because she thought the princess could cure him. A moment later, the lord burst into the office. He looked at Rani and asked if anyone was hurt. Rani looked at the lord and said that the emperor was fine, and she also asked him to take care of the princess. The lord came closer to the princess and asked if she was all right. The princess said in a trembling voice that she was fine. Lor said that in that case, if she allowed it, he would like to help her. The princess looked at them intently. She was very surprised and frightened. Rani looked at the princess and said that she would visit her soon. The emperor called Rani. She looked at him and told him that not a drop of blood had been spilled, and no one had died, so he had nothing to worry about. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Ronaldina was in shock. She didn't know where to start talking. The doctor looked at Ronnie and asked if she had really come to see the princess. She said that was so, and asked how the princess was feeling. The doctor said that she was not harmed thanks to her, but she still needs rest. Ronaldina looked at the doctor in surprise and asked where he was going. The doctor said that he now has a meeting with Vahern. Ronnie noticed that the doctor called the Lord by name. She thought they were very close. She knew they met every day to discuss medical research. She realized that she also needed to focus on her work. The princess saw her, and she called. The princess in turn was very glad to see her savior. The princess looked at her and asked, not with a smile, "Why don't she sit down?" Ronnie was surprised by such a change in the princess. Ronnie asked the princess how she was feeling. Ronaldina was shocked and did not understand why they were holding hands now. The princess said that she feels well now, but still she was just a little surprised. That's all. Ronnie looked at the princess and asked her for forgiveness, since she should have been there. The princess looked at her and said that everything was wrong. The princess said that she would have been in more trouble if it weren't for Ronnie. The princess smiled and said that she should have told her this before, but she is saying it now. The princess thanked her with a smile. She said that you are not saying this as a representative of your country, but as a person who would like to thank his savior. She said she was very scared. The princess said with a smile on her face that she could still hear her voice, which brought her out of the darkness. The princess looked at her and asked if she could give her a gift as a token of gratitude. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what was happening. She hoped the princess didn't fall in love with her. The princess smiled and said that this was very interesting. She saw a beautiful necklace and said she thought it would look great on her. The princess looked at the necklace and said that she really liked the design, but she still thought it was very catchy. The young lady was in shock and did not understand how it had come to this. The princess looked at her and said with a smile that she heard there was a busy street market in the center. She looked at her and asked if she could take her there. Ronaldina had the feeling that the princess was now comfortable next to her, but still she tried her best to concentrate. She was next to the princess, and I wondered if it was her. She felt like something was wrong. The princess looked at her surprised. The princess looked at her and said that she thought it was her first time at the center. The princess asked if she didn't like it. Or maybe it's just her. The young lady smiled and said that everything was not so simple. She was now seeing it. She looked at the princess and said with a smile that she was very glad to spend time with her. She looked at the princess and asked, "Why don't they go there?" The princess was very happy to hear this. The princess looked, but they asked her if it was not a good idea to go out today. She sighed heavily. The streets were actually lively. Everyone had smiles on their faces, and the streets were literally filled with people. She thought that perhaps she was simply unsettled by the energy of the city. Compared to the streets she grew up on, everything was different here. The princess showed the little animal to her and asked if it was cute. Ronnie was in shock. She didn't understand what kind of animal it was. She wondered if such animals were seriously sold. The saleswoman looked at the princess and asked if it was obvious that this was a black panther. The princess was surprised, looked at her and said that it was a very cute animal, and she also asked how much it cost. The knight came closer to Ronnie and said that the princess likes cute things. Ronnie looked at him and told him not to say that he also thought such an animal was cute. He said that the princess also has a love for unique and original things. She was surprised, but saw how the princess was having fun. But a moment later, Ronnie saw that the princess had drooped. Ronnie came closer to the princess and asked what happened. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked why she looked bored next to her and so animated when talking to her knight. Ronnie now understood how the princess felt. The truth was that the princess knew their secret, and she had no idea what was on her mind or whether she had ulterior motives. Ronnie looked at the princess and said that everything was simple because she was not used to such shopping. Ronnie asked her for forgiveness, and as an apology, she invited her to tea. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to treat her to tea. Ronnie said that she didn't need any gifts and would rather get to know each other over a cup of tea. Ronnie noticed that the princess was starting to attract a lot of attention. Ronnie looked at her and said with a smile that it looked like they would have tea next time. The princess looked at her and said with a smile that they would go straight away to drink tea. The princess looked at her and asked which tea she liked best. She also asked if she liked desserts for tea. The princess said that she recently saw a bakery nearby. She smiled and said they could buy dessert there. Ronnie was shocked because she realized that today was not her day at all. Sometime later, they were sitting in a cafe. She felt very awkward with the princess. The princess, in turn, was very surprised, as suddenly silence overtook them. Ronaldina noticed that the princess had returned to her usual calmness. But even in this position, she noticed that the princess wanted to say something. Ronnie looked at the princess and asked if she was tired of everyone's attention. The princess said it seemed like it was all because of her rare hair color. The princess looked at her and said that, to tell the truth, she thought Ronaldina was beautiful. Ronnie realized she needed to quickly change the subject. She looked at the princess and said that she was worried that she was not feeling well because of the weather. A moment later, the young lady saw that the princess was sad. She was shocked because she didn't understand what was wrong. She looked at the princess and said that she did not need to answer, since she knew that everyone has their own duty and their own problems. But she still wanted to understand if the princess had ulterior motives. The princess said that this is the height of the dialogue, but the truth is that she came here in hopes of seducing the emperor. Ronnie was shocked by what she heard. She didn't expect this at all. She looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The princess said she had been preparing for this moment most of her life. She spent a long time learning to be as elegant and well-mannered as possible. She was constantly reminded that it was time for etiquette class. The princess said that only Igor, who was with her all this time, knows the real her. The young lady looked sideways at the knight. The princess said she had to make sure everyone saw her as an elegant princess. She always did everything according to etiquette. She grew up to realize that something was wrong with her life, and at first, she tried to come to terms with it. The young lady was shocked as she remembered this part of the story. The princess said that a few months ago, her parents presented her with a fait accompli. They said it was time for her to go to Avernus and seduce the emperor. She said it was for her country. The young lady was shocked because she realized that this was true, and the princess did not come here of her own free will. The princess said she must look stupid now, letting her parents control her life. Ronnie looked at her and said that wasn't true. She said that she remembered her confidence in the presence of His Majesty. The princess said that she had never gone against her parents before. But instead of seduction, she simply delayed negotiations. Ronnie looked at the princess in surprise. The princess smiled and said that the young lady was right, because her heart belongs to her country and its people. The princess said with a smile that Ronaldina was right, and her heart belonged to the country and its people. The princess looked at the young lady and said that now she knew her reason for appearing here. The princess looked at her and said that she felt that the young lady was uncomfortable being around her now. Her conscience was always crystal clear. She always wanted to lead a safe and comfortable life. She sincerely hoped and wanted the princess to help His Majesty with his problem. Ronaldina looked at the princess and said that it was very good that next to His Majesty there was such a kind person like her who was sympathetic to his injury. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise. A moment later, she smiled at her. The princess said that jumping to conclusions never did any good. Ronaldina knew that Celia was a mystery to her. But after a dialogue with the princess, she was able to remember certain fragments of the novel. Ronaldina was sure that she would not see her again after their tea party, since she knew that her goal was to seduce His Majesty. Ronaldina understood that the princess would behave as usual. She was walking slowly along the corridor when she suddenly heard someone calling her. She was shocked because she heard the princess calling her. Ronaldina sighed heavily as she understood that dialogue was inevitable. The princess looked at her and asked if she was busy. Ronnie addressed the princess by her title. The princess told Ronaldina that she would not do that since they agreed to call each other by name when they were alone. The princess had been following her around for the past few days, but Ronaldina couldn't even complain about her because she really interfered with her work. The princess looked at her friend and asked if she was bothering her. The young lady was shocked by such an unexpected question from the princess. The princess, in turn, looked at her with eyes full of tears. She looked at the princess and said that she had nothing to say. The princess asked her if she hadn't said before that she was going to go to the orphanage. The princess looked at her and asked Ronaldina to take her with her. Ronaldina looked at her and said she couldn't do it. The princess was puzzled because she really wanted to go with Ronaldina. The princess looked at Rani and said that she would be more careful. She said she loves children, and she would be happy to join her. Rani was shocked and did not understand why the princess was acting this way. From what she had read about the princess before, the princess was supposed to be cool-headed and considerate. Rani looked at the princess and said that she did not know when she would leave. She looked at the princess and said that she would certainly tell her when everything was ready. The princess was very happy, which even sparkled with happiness. The princess hugged the young lady with a smile and said that she was very happy and would immediately prepare something for the children. Rani understood that if she had refused the princess, she would not have left her alone. Rani looked at the princess and said that she had to go. The princess looked at the young lady and asked if she was going home. She said with a smile that in that case they would see each other later. Rani was surprised that the princess wanted to come to her tomorrow. Rani in turn looked closely at the princess and said goodbye to her with a smile on her face, but she still felt uncomfortable about it all. She knew that she needed to hide her emotions for the sake of His Majesty, but she never wanted to be friends with his future lover. However, she knew that the real problem was closer than she thought. She knew that her problem was now sitting outside the door. A moment later, she entered the office. She knew that His Majesty's condition had worsened recently. The medication keeps him from losing consciousness, but the side effects still remain. The Emperor looked at her intently and angrily. The Emperor was shocked because he realized that she always caught him when he was very ill. The young lady knew that she had to leave in time so that the princess could save His Majesty. But everyone believed that only she could help. The Emperor Uciel looked at her and called. Rani knew she had no need to feel guilty. She looked at them and said that she needed to go back to the Department of Internal Affairs. A moment later, she left the room. She knew that she would soon go to the shelter. She wanted to be there as soon as possible. She missed her children very much. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked what would happen if the children were not happy with her. Rani smiled and said that everything would be fine since she had already sent the message. Rani wondered how they could be upset with these gifts that the princess herself had prepared. The princess looked at her and asked, "What if suddenly the gifts did not fit into the carriage?" Rani looked closely at the palace. She looked at the princess and asked permission to load all the gifts into the carriage. Rani looked at the princess and said that everything was ready and asked if they could leave. The princess looked at the young lady and asked, "What if they hated her?" Rani smiled and said that the children would think that Christmas came early this year. Rani said that the princess had no reason to worry. A moment later, the young lady greeted them. She said with a smile that she was very interested in what was causing such a commotion. Ronaldina saw Modana. She was very surprised and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. Rani was surprised and couldn't believe that she was actually here. For some time, the children were very happy and surprised by the gift. The little girl came closer to Rani and asked why she was crying. Rani glared at her friend. She couldn't stop her tears flowing like a stream. Medina looked at Rani and asked if she felt better. She said that she didn't know that she in turn missed her so much. She called Rani, "Because I noticed that she didn't look very good." She looked at her and asked what was going on. Rani said she fell in love with someone. The young lady was surprised. She looked at her and asked if she was serious now. She looked at Rani and said that she had never dated anyone before. She also said that she would not look for a mate until she earned enough money. Ronaldina said she was busy. Then Medina said that she is sure that she has more things to do in the palace now. Ronan said, puzzled, that it was true. Medina looked at her and said that she was very interested. Medina looked at her and asked if someone had really abandoned her, and that's why she was crying. Medina was furious. She didn't understand how this could even happen. Medina was burning with anger. She said that she must certainly curse him. Rani was shocked. She understood that cursing the emperor must be tantamount to high treason. Rani looked at her friend and said, puzzled, that she had not yet confessed her feelings to him. Rani looked at her friend and said that he was destined to be with someone else. The young lady was surprised. She looked at Rani and said that she, in turn, had been focused on making money all her life. It was very funny for her to hear her talk about love and fate. She said she decided to keep distance between them anyway, but still she helps him solve his problems. She looked at Rani and asked if she was helping him with his problems. Rani said that was true. Medina looked at her and said that she had previously said that a man is destined to be with someone else. Medina asked if they were really not together. Now Medina looked at her and asked what the problem was. Then, she said Ronnie could just take him away. Ronnie was puzzled. She said that they really were made for each other. Medina was in shock and had problems understanding. Medina looked at her and asked if she was really helping him for the sake of her beloved Ronnie. Was surprised she looked at her friend and asked what she was talking about. Medina said that she felt as if Ronnie was trying to deny her feelings for him. Medina said that Ronnie can help him regardless of her feelings, because helping someone does not mean loving. Medina said he just feels grateful. Medina came closer to her friend. She smiled and hugged her tightly. Medina told her not to worry, because the more she thinks about it, the more complicated everything will become. She had a tendency to overthink everything. Medina told her not to stress herself out, in vain. Ronnie sighed heavily. Ronaldina said that she would certainly do everything in her power to help him. While going down the stairs, they heard a noise. The young girls ran up to Ronnie. She looked at them and with a smile told them not to run as they might get hurt. She asked them to come one by one. She was talking with their children. Then she noticed that the princess was sitting upset about something. She saw that the princess was very tired. Medina looked at the little children and said that now is time for a snack. She led them to the kitchen. The young lady looked at the princess and asked for forgiveness. She smiled and asked if the children were pestering her. The princess said that there was nothing wrong with it and she had a lot of fun. Ronnie looked at the princess and said that she was very sorry for leaving her alone. Ronnie looked at the princess intently. She did not know what she should say if they asked her why she was crying. The princess looked at the young lady and asked, "Why don't they have a snack too?" Ronnie was surprised. Ronnie realized that the princess was trying to please her. She couldn't help it, but she liked it. Sometime later, Ronnie was sitting at a tea party. Ronnie was not very comfortable. Since the villain was sitting in front of her, in all her glory, Verica looked at the young lady intently and angrily. Ronnie knew that sometimes life throws you for a loop. The young lady attended the tea party only because the princess insisted on her presence. Ronnie knew that this princess had invited everyone, but today was a tea party. Verica, daughter of a former investor. Next to her sat a lady from a house famous for creating exquisite jewelry. Others are ladies whose families make beautiful furniture and fashionable clothes. Some are famous for their porcelain products, so they all come from families famous for their business. Connections with these families are very beneficial for the princess. The young lady looked at the princess and asked if she didn't say that she would be even busier from now on. The princess looked at her and said that the hunting festival was starting soon. She was asked how she knew this. The princess said that it was a famous place located in the mountains surrounding Avernus. This is a huge event in which what is extracted is evenly distributed among different areas. Ronnie knew this was truly something special, but she also knew it would be a lot of work. The young ladies looked at the princess and said with a smile that it was good then. They wanted to know if His Majesty would attend this year. Ronnie knew that many nobles were watching others hunt as well. She looked at them and said with a smile that she did not yet know about his decision, but it looks like he'll be taking part again this year. The young ladies looked at her in surprise and asked if this year they would see His Majesty at his best. They were sure that this year he would become the best hunter again. Ronnie looked closely at the princess. The princess looked at them and asked if perhaps she could take part in the hunt. Ronnie looked at the princess in surprise. Verica looked at the princess with a grin and said that she was the head of the foreign delegation. She asked the princess why she wanted to take part in their hunt. She said that the princess could enjoy the show like all the other guests, since they wouldn't want her to ruin the holiday with her injury. She said that if this happened, it would cause friction between their empires. She said that she was sure that His Majesty would not allow her to take part in the hunt. Ronnie looked at Verica in surprise, because here she agreed with her. The princess looked at her and said with a smile that she might not be as good as the knights, but she was not a bad hunter. Verica looked at the princess and said that, as far as she understood, the princess could still become a victim. The princess looked at them and said that the biggest question was whether His Majesty would agree. The princess said that she was sure that the emperor would certainly agree. Ronnie was shocked and understood that this should not happen, since in the novel, the princess is attacked during the festival. Ronnie hoped that His Majesty would not accept Celia. Ronnie looked at her friend in surprise and asked if the emperor had agreed to her request. The lord said that the princess sent a letter to her parents, and the king said not to bring the empire to justice. If something happens, it will happen. Therefore, the emperor had no choice but to concede. Rani was in shock. She didn't know what to do now. She didn't know if she should follow the princess everywhere. She didn't know how she could deal with the knights. She didn't know how long they should protect the emperor. Yusio looked at her and said with a smile that her eyes were now glazed over like a dead fish. Rani looked at him and said with a smile that now was not the time for jokes. The emperor looked at them and asked what they were both doing now. He asked why they both were gossiping. The emperor said that they certainly had something to do. He told them to get to work, as they had a lot to discuss. Lord thought that His Majesty relented, but he seemed to be himself again. He wondered if it was all from the medicine. He hoped that a suitable cure would soon be found. Lord Yu in turn stared at the emperor. He wondered if the emperor was being built because of something else. Rani knew she needed to prepare for the hunting festival, but she also knew that her main concern was the safety of the princess. She knew that there was a small cliff in that area. The medicines collected there should be distributed evenly. Ronaldina wanted to recruit more knights to make sure no one got inside. She understood that this was an ordinary forest, but she still had no idea where the killers would decide to attack. She remembered that in the novel, the young villainess Verica joined the guild of shadow assassins. She double-checked that there were enough people there to commit the murder. Rani knew that many people did not know about the existence of this guild. She even remembered the location. She looked at everyone gathered and said that she was going to deliver the layout to you, Royal Order of Knighthood. She knew she had to leave before His Majesty started grumbling again. Sometimes she thought it was just a novella. She didn't know why she gave it her all. Then she could always go to another country if something went wrong. She didn't understand why she was trying to save all these characters back then, but she still knew that she had come too far to just run away. Ronaldina began to protect some people too much, and the plot simply pointed in the direction that leads to the right path. She walked towards the panther located in the center of the square. She understood that she simply had no choice. She walked towards the panther statue located in the center of the square. Opposite the statues are pubs, and the one she needs will be the third one from the left. She was shocked as she felt like one of the accomplices of the villain. She wondered if she should have come here after all, but she didn't have enough money to hire someone else. She understood that she had to pay a lot to cancel Verica's request. The man looked at her and greeted her with a smile. He asked if she was ready to order. She gave him a bag of money and told him to take it and bring her a beer. The man looked at the money dumbfounded. A moment later, he brought her a beer, under which there was a note. The man smiled and said she could have fun. The young lady knew that everything was as described in the story. She paid the money and got access. She had a map to the secret passage. The young lady slowly decided to go towards her goal. She knew it was located at the back of the pub. She walked immediately. She knew that the door was hidden in the wall. She knew it was all a secret. But it was still hard for Ronnie to differentiate between things. Ronaldina entered the dark room. Ronaldina was a little surprised, since the room was not at all different from the one outside. The man looked at her and asked if she had finished inspecting the premises. He said that if she was done with this, then she could tell him the purpose of her visit. She looked at him and said that she wanted them to terminate the murder contract they had recently entered into. The man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She handed him a bag of money. It contained her 2 months' salary. The man looked at the money in surprise. He looked at her and asked what order they should cancel on her behalf. The young lady was shocked, as it was very simple. She said that someone came to them here with a request to kill the blonde lady during the upcoming hunt. She looked at him and told him not to agree. She said he could tell his client that they failed to complete the task. The man looked at her and asked if she was sure that this was really what she wanted. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. She asked if there were any problems with this. He said he wasn't sure that was possible. Ronnie slowly walked to the palace. She was shocked by what happened. She was surprised, because the man told her that they had not received such orders. She looked intently at the palace. She was shocked and didn't understand where she could have gone wrong. She knew that she had no choice but to ask the knights to keep an eye on the princess. She was distracted from her thoughts as she looked at the palace. She noticed that the palace was very beautiful from the outside. The princess allowed her to accompany her during the hunt. The princess smiled and said that she would be very glad if she would join her on the hunt. She understood that everything was not so bad, and the shadows would not be able to kill the princess. A moment later, she was surprised because she saw light in the emperor's window. But a moment later, she saw the emperor himself on the terrace. She ran towards him with the speed of lightning. She understood that she could not delay another minute. The knights looked at her and said that she should not be here. The young lady angrily told them to get out of the way. She looked at them and said that they could later say that she herself broke in alone, and she would personally explain everything to the emperor. She looked at them and told them not to let anyone inside, or she will write a complaint against them. The young lady hurried to the emperor. She ran as fast as she could. She burst into the emperor's room and called him. She saw him standing on the terrace. She understood that she could not let her guard down in this world. She ran up to him and hugged him tightly. A moment later, the young lady fell to the ground along with the emperor. She called him and asked him to wake up. She noticed that the emperor looked weaker than usual. The young lady was in shock and did not understand what had happened. She still knew that he would suffer. She was shocked because she knew she was a complete fool, and she should have done something to help him. She understood that if she had helped him, he would not be suffering now. She understood that if she had helped him, then everything would be much better now. She didn't know if there was a way to get to the root of his suffering. She couldn't find anything in the library archives. However, she was able to piece together the storyline after the princess's story. She didn't know if he could do something like that for the emperor. She understood that if he had told her his story in person, then everything would have been different. The young lady looked at the door in surprise. But later, she looked at the emperor and asked what was happening in his nightmares. She wondered if there was a way to take away or overcome his trauma. She wondered if there was more to you in his nightmares than what she already knew. She sighed heavily, as she did not expect an answer from him now. She hoped that there was someone who had been in the palace long enough to know the answers to her questions. She had no longer had the ability to give him temporary treatment. She hoped that maybe there would be someone who could help him. She wanted to learn more about his illness and find the person who could help him. She sat and thought about everything. At the same time, she made notes. She remembered the Duke's words, who said that the emperor went through a lot in his youth. But he also put a lot of effort into making the empire powerful. The young lady looked at her maid and asked if she could send a letter to the Duke as soon as possible. Mevin looked at her and said with a smile that it must be an urgent matter, and she will do everything immediately. She looked at her and asked if she had worked there before. Ronnie smiled and told her friend that she had a great memory. She said she could get ready on her own today. The maid of honor smiled and said that all she did was speak well of the Duke. Mevin looked at the young lady and told her to make sure she didn't forget anything while she wasn't around. The young lady was puzzled. She wondered how His Majesty was feeling today. She was sure he had heard about what happened last night. She wondered if he was even alive. She heard the scent of perfume the minute she opened the door. The young people greeted the emperor. Ronnie looked at the Lord and asked why he came at all, since she told him to sleep. He told her that this would only be possible if she took care of the imperial finances on his behalf. She said she thought when he was busy, he needed to cut down on his sleep. The Lord looked at her and said with a smirk that she was cold. The Lord looked at all the documents with puzzlement and asked if the work would ever end. Ronnie understood him perfectly. Ronnie looked closely at the emperor. She understood that he seemed to be in a bad mood again. The young lady understood that she should immediately begin her work. A moment later, she was lying on the table, as she was very tired from all the work. She knew she couldn't stand it any longer and needed a break. She looked at the documents and said that there was an error with the supplies for the quarter. She looked at the Lord and noticed that he seemed to have lost consciousness. My lady glared at the emperor. She knew that he always tapped his finger on the table when he had a headache. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise, as she realized that he was feeling bad now. She came closer to him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what happened. Ronnie looked at the emperor and said with a smile that today was not the height of the banquet. The emperor looked at her in surprise. She looked at him and asked permission to be useful to him. The emperor looked at her intently and in surprise. The young lady noticed that the emperor did not mind her proposal. She asked him to get well soon. She thought that soon even the color would return to his face. A moment later, they heard a knock on the door. The butlers came to them and asked forgiveness for disturbing them. He said he came to deliver an urgent message. Ronnie looked at him and asked if it was for His Majesty. The butler looked at the young lady and said that he brought this message for the secretary from the Duke. Ronnie was surprised that the Duke answered her so quickly. The Duke wrote to her that he could find time for her. Today, he asked me to tell him when she could come to him. You are surprised since his name was not that close, but he was able to quickly respond to her request. The Emperor looked at the butler and said that if it were urgent, the Duke would have sent a messenger. The operator said that if he wanted a response by mail, he should have waited until their workday was over. He told Butler that he should have known better than anyone. The butler looked at the Emperor and asked for forgiveness. He said that he thought it would be urgent to inform Ronaldina about this. He said that he didn't want to disturb them at all, but he thought it was very important. Ronaldina was shocked as his answer came earlier than she expected. She hoped that today she could be free early and pay the Duke a visit. She wanted to figure everything out quickly. She was riding in a carriage. The young lady was very pleased with the views from the window. It had been a long time since she last enjoyed this beautiful view. She hoped it wouldn't be too rude for her to come the same day she received the letter. The young lady heard the man say that they had already arrived at the place. As soon as she got out of the carriage, he called her. The young lady was surprised. She did not expect to be greeted so quickly and warmly. Moreover, the Duke himself came out to meet her. She felt very pleased and warm in her heart. The young people greeted her with a smile and told her to quickly come to them. They were glad that she came to them. They looked at her and asked if she should be back before dark. They said they had prepared tea in advance. Ronaldina looked at Geraldo, and with a smile, she said that they had not seen each other, and she also asked how he was doing. The young man smiled and said that he was fine. The Duke looked at her and said with a smile that she must be here on a very important matter. He knew she wasn't one to rush. She looked at him and asked if he could tell. The Duke looked at her and asked with a smile, "What happened?" He said that she could calmly ask him whatever she wanted, and he would tell her everything. The young lady looked at him and said that she had some questions that only he could answer. She said she wasn't sure, son, what she should start with. She looked at him and said that he used to say that he worked in the royal palace when their empire was still a kingdom. The Duke looked at her and said that it was so, but he left of his own free will. The Duke looked at her and thought he said that, looking at His Majesty, he now regrets his actions. The young lady was surprised. She looked at him and asked if he could tell him what happened in the palace during his stay there and what His Majesty went through. The Duke looked at her and said, puzzled, that this was a very complicated story. The Duke said that he had never seen a man who suffered so much as His Majesty. Avernus became an empire thanks to the great emperor. But 30 years ago, they were an ordinary small kingdom. The Duke said he was unaware of the problems until he succeeded his father and began working at the royal palace. The queen was furious. She screamed at her husband because she did not understand how he could cheat on her with another. She looked at him and asked if he didn't feel sorry for his own child. The king looked at her and said that this was not what she thought. The queen said angrily that everyone was gossiping about it. It is said that the king has no concubine, but he also does not respect his queen. She was furious and screamed at him not to rummage through the royal funds. She begged him to be careful. The greater king was only interested in satisfying his own personal interests. The situation worsened after the birth of the crown prince. Every day, the queen burst into bitter tears in front of her son. The king drowned in alcohol and women. The king stopped paying attention to his family. The queen, in turn, did not stop raising her son. But still every day he saw her tears. His Majesty had only his mother on whom he could rely. The crown prince ran into his mother's room and asked with a smile if she was there. The queen looked at her son with tears in her eyes and smiled at him. After 30 years of oblivion, she could not stand it for the rest of her life. It was very difficult for her to live such an unbearable life. Later, they learned that a tragedy had occurred that shook the entire empire. The queen fell to her death in front of her son. The crown prince witnessed the death of his mother. The Duke looked at Ronnie and said that it was a terrifying experience for the young boy. She was shocked by what she heard. The Duke said that the king in turn gradually went crazy and blamed his little son for the death of his wife. The king constantly shouted at his son. He said that it was all because of him. The king told his son that the queen was weak to give birth to him, and it was all his fault. The Duke said that at that point, he left the palace to start a new life as a businessman. The Duke said the king later continued to verbally abuse his own son. He said that he was sure that the king did this for tea, to alleviate his guilt. His Majesty ascended to the throne after his father drank himself to death, and he had to fight tooth and nail to defend the throne. There were forces that tried to influence the emperor for their own benefit. The Duke said that still he could not give up everything to go over to His Majesty's side. So after everything, the emperor was left completely alone and took care of himself. The emperor was completely alone in his large palace. The young lady noticed that the imperial palace looked melancholy at night. She remembered the last time she saw the emperor on the terrace. She looked at the terrace and saw that there was no one there. She hoped that His Majesty was still at home. Now she understood why he was suffering from a psychological disorder. To forget the past, he had no choice but to become a workaholic, pushing yourself to the limit. It was the only way to forget about the pain and fear. She began to remember some details from the novel. The Duke's hearing seems to have provoked this. She noticed that the light was burning brightly in His Majesty's office. She brought up that he was working to forget himself. For physical labor will improve mental pain. And even despite his traumatic past, he never stopped working. The emperor looked at her in surprise and called. She was shocked because she understood that he was giving all of himself to protect the empire. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked for forgiveness. She said she had no intention of coming to the office. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady looked intently at the emperor. She was shocked as she noticed that she was shedding tears. She didn't expect this. The young lady said in a trembling voice that she must have simply forgotten. She said that now his permission will go away. The emperor took a chair and came closer to her. He asked her to wait a little. Ronaldina knew that she could not help the emperor. Ronaldina remembered excerpts from the novel. A picture appeared before her eyes. The beautiful princess looks at the emperor with a smile on her face and asks how he is feeling. At the same time, she called him by name. The emperor also answered her with a smile that he was much better. A moment later, the emperor came closer to her and gently hugged her shoulders. He looked at her and asked if she was okay. The young lady was surprised. She turned around and saw the emperor in front of her smiling and saying that without her, he would go crazy. He told her that he felt the truth could breathe. She was shocked because she raised little, that it was all pretense. She knew it might take a while, but he would eventually fall in love with someone else. Ronaldina knew that only the princess could heal him from his mental trauma. The emperor looked at her and asked her to wait a little. The young lady asked his forgiveness in a trembling voice and said that she needed some time. The emperor looked at her in surprise. The young lady continued to cry, but the emperor in turn did not let her go and gently held her shoulders. She was very surprised because she realized that the emperor wanted to console her. After a while, she stopped crying, but she still felt very embarrassed for crying in front of him. The young lady looked sideways at the emperor and said that she did not want to disturb him at all. She said she had to go now. The emperor looked at her and said that she now looked as if she had problems with her balance. He looked at her and tenderly asked if she would like to sit down. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise. She was surprised because she didn't expect him to say something like that. The emperor returned and said that he did not mind. A moment later, the emperor sat down at the table and began to look at the documents. The young lady was surprised that he returned to his work again. The emperor looked at her and asked what she had decided. She looked at him and softly said that she would sit down now. A moment after the young lady sat down at the table, the emperor stood up. She was surprised and did not understand what he was going to do. She thought he would sit next to her. The emperor slowly brewed tea and poured it into cups. She looked at him and said softly that she could make the tea herself. The emperor looked at her and said with a smile that the tea was ready. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect the emperor to do something like this. They sat in complete silence for some time. The young lady looked at him and said that she thought she should go already. The emperor looked at the documents in surprise. Rani looked closely at the emperor. She saw his puzzled face. She thought that most likely he had a headache again. Rani came closer to him and took his hand. The emperor looked at her in surprise and said that sometimes she forgets that he is the emperor of their empire. She looked at him and said with a smile that he had already given her permission, before the young lady looked at the emperor and asked if he was hallucinating again. She smiled softly and said that she knew it was helping us time, so she asked him to bear with her for a little while. She looked at him and said that he had problems with his circulation. The emperor was surprised. She said his hands were cold, and she thought he should stop sitting at a desk all day, and he needs to exercise periodically. Ronnie looked at him and told him that he should eat normally. The young lady looked at the emperor and asked if he was listening to her. The emperor said that he was not deaf. She smiled and said that he should look at others when they were having a conversation. The emperor looked at her in surprise. A moment later, their gazes met. Ronnie looked at the emperor confusedly and decided to change the topic. She said that she had heard earlier that the princess was going to participate in the care. The emperor looked at her and said that it was, but she would only participate on one condition. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise. What condition are we talking about? She was alarmed by what she heard. The emperor said that if she won, she would ask for help for her country. The emperor said that this would not happen anytime soon. But still the young lady was skeptical about the emperor's words, because she knew that the princess had been practicing ball control from an early age. The emperor said that he would win. The young lady knew that His Majesty's hunting skill was second to none. The young lady looked at the emperor and asked if he could take part in the nursing festival, which was held in the imperial palace. The emperor looked at her and asked who cared. He said with a grin that he created these rules, and he started a hunting festival so that he would have a reason to go somewhere. The emperor looked intently at his hand. The young lady understood that this was so, since it was very difficult for the emperor to get out somewhere due to his illness. This not only shows the world how he is doing, but also provides food for the people of the empire. And it also gives him a little room to breathe. But still, she was very sorry for the emperor that he could not just walk in peace. She looked at him and asked with a smile if he wanted to freshen up a little. The emperor looked at her in surprise, holding her hand. A moment later, he asked what she meant. She looked at him and said with a smile that it was late, but they had some moonlight. She held his hand tenderly. The emperor fixed his gaze on the documents. He was surprised by this proposal. A moment later, he looked at his companion and asked her to wait a little. The emperor said that he did not want to go out because he could not do it, and she knows perfectly why. The lady looked at the emperor and softly asked if he still heard voices in his head. She asked him if he still saw the dark shadows that blurred in front of him. She smiled and said that he said earlier that shadows, hallucinations, and pain all disappear when she holds his hand. She smiled and said that's why he could just follow her. Some time later, they were walking leisurely on the street. The emperor was puzzled, as he had not seen his companion so close to him for a long time. The young lady noticed that the emperor hardly spoke. She knew that he seemed to be enjoying the wonderful silence now. She was very happy and pleased that he was comfortable. The young lady was glad that he could give him some peace and quiet. She was very glad that they were able to go outside. She was happy that she could just give him a little freedom. The young lady looked at him and said that she had some questions that only he could answer. She said she wasn't sure, son, what she should start with. She looked at him and said that he used to say that he worked in the royal palace when their empire was still a kingdom. The duke looked at her and said that it was so, but he left of his own free will. The duke looked at her and thought he said that looking at His Majesty, he now regrets his actions. The young lady was surprised. She looked at him and asked if he could tell him what happened in the palace during his stay there and what His Majesty went through. The duke looked at her and said, puzzled, that this was a very complicated story. The duke said that he had never seen a man who suffered so much as His Majesty. Avernus became an empire thanks to the great emperor. But 30 years ago, they were an ordinary small kingdom. The duke said he was unaware of the problems until he succeeded his father and began working at the royal palace. The queen was furious. She screamed at her husband because she did not understand how he could cheat on her with another. She looked at him and asked if he didn't feel sorry for his own child. The king looked at her and said that this was not what she thought. The queen said angrily that everyone was gossiping about it. It is said that the king has no concubine, but he also does not respect his queen. She was furious and screamed at him not to rummage through the royal funds. She begged him to be careful. The greater king was only interested in satisfying his own personal interests. The situation worsened after the birth of the crown prince. Every day, the queen burst into bitter tears in front of her son. The king drowned in alcohol and women. The king stopped paying attention to his family. The queen, in turn, did not stop raising her son. But still every day he saw her tears. His Majesty had only his mother on whom he could rely. The crown prince ran into his mother's room and asked with a smile if she was there. The queen looked at her son with tears in her eyes and smiled at him. After 30 years of oblivion, she could not stand it for the rest of her life. It was very difficult for her to live such an unbearable life. Later, they learned that a tragedy had occurred that shook the entire empire. The queen fell to her death in front of her son. The crown prince witnessed the death of his mother. The duke looked at Ronnie and said that it was a terrifying experience for the young boy. She was shocked by what she heard. The duke said that the king in turn gradually went crazy and blamed his little son for the death of his wife. The king constantly shouted at his son. He said that it was all because of him. The king told his son that the queen was weak to give birth to him, and it was all his fault. The duke said that at that point, he left the palace to start a new life as a businessman. The duke said the king later continued to verbally abuse his own son. He said that he was sure that the king did this for tea, to alleviate his guilt. His Majesty ascended to the throne after his father drank himself to death, and he had to fight tooth and nail to defend the throne. There were forces that tried to influence the emperor for their own benefit. The duke said that still he could not give up everything to go over to his Majesty's side. So after everything, the emperor was left completely alone and took care of himself. The emperor was completely alone in his large palace. The young lady noticed that the imperial palace looked melancholy at night. She remembered the last time she saw the emperor on the terrace. She looked at the terrace and saw that there was no one there. She hoped that His Majesty was still at home. Now she understood why he was suffering from a psychological disorder. To forget the past, he had no choice but to become a workaholic, pushing yourself to the limit. It was the only way to forget about the pain and fear. She began to remember some details from the novel. The Duke's hearing seems to have provoked this. She noticed that the light was burning brightly in His Majesty's office. She brought up that he was working to forget himself. For physical labor will improve mental pain. And even despite his traumatic past, he never stopped working. The emperor looked at her in surprise and called. She was shocked because she understood that he was giving all of himself to protect the empire. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked for forgiveness. She said she had no intention of coming to the office. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady looked intently at the emperor. She was shocked as she noticed that she was shedding tears. She didn't expect this. The young lady said in a trembling voice that she must have simply forgotten. She said that now his permission will go away. The emperor took a chair and came closer to her. He asked her to wait a little. Ronaldina knew that she could not help the emperor. Ronaldina remembered excerpts from the novel. A picture appeared before her eyes. The beautiful princess looks at the emperor with a smile on her face and asks how he is feeling. At the same time, she called him by name. The emperor also answered her with a smile that he was much better. A moment later, the emperor came closer to her and gently hugged her shoulders. He looked at her and asked if she was okay. The young lady was surprised. She turned around and saw the emperor in front of her smiling and saying that without her, he would go crazy. He told her that he felt the truth could breathe. She was shocked because she raised little, that it was all pretense. She knew it might take a while, but he would eventually fall in love with someone else. Ronaldina knew that only the princess could heal him from his mental trauma. The emperor looked at her and asked her to wait a little. The young lady asked his forgiveness in a trembling voice and said that she needed some time. The emperor looked at her in surprise. The young lady continued to cry, but the emperor in turn did not let her go and gently held her shoulders. She was very surprised because she realized that the emperor wanted to console her. After a while, she stopped crying, but she still felt very embarrassed for crying in front of him. The young lady looked sideways at the emperor and said that she did not want to disturb him at all. She said she had to go now. The emperor looked at her and said that she now looked as if she had problems with her balance. He looked at her and tenderly asked if she would like to sit down. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise. She was surprised because she didn't expect him to say something like that. The emperor returned and said that he did not mind. A moment later, the emperor sat down at the table and began to look at the documents. The young lady was surprised that he returned to his work again. The emperor looked at her and asked what she had decided. She looked at him and softly said that she would sit down now. A moment after the young lady sat down at the table, the emperor stood up. She was surprised and did not understand what he was going to do. She thought he would sit next to her. The emperor slowly brewed tea and poured it into cups. She looked at him and said softly that she could make the tea herself. The emperor looked at her and said with a smile that the tea was ready. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect the emperor to do something like this. They sat in complete silence for some time. The young lady looked at him and said that she thought she should go already. The emperor looked at the documents in surprise. Rani looked closely at the emperor. She saw his puzzled face. She thought that most likely he had a headache again. Rani came closer to him and took his hand. The emperor looked at her in surprise and said that sometimes she forgets that he is the emperor of their empire. She looked at him and said with a smile that he had already given her permission before the young lady looked at the emperor and asked if he was hallucinating again. She smiled softly and said that she knew it was helping us time, so she asked him to bear with her for a little while. She looked at him and said that he had problems with his circulation. The emperor was surprised. She said his hands were cold, and she thought he should stop sitting at a desk all day, and he needs to exercise periodically. Rani looked at him and told him that he should eat normally. The young lady looked at the emperor and asked if he was listening to her. The emperor said that he was not deaf. She smiled and said that he should look at others when they were having a conversation. The emperor looked at her in surprise. A moment later, their gazes met. Rani looked at the emperor confusedly and decided to change the topic. She said that she had heard earlier that the princess was going to participate in the care. The emperor looked at her and said that it was, but she would only participate on one condition. The young lady looked at the emperor in surprise. What condition are we talking about? She was alarmed by what she heard. The emperor said that if she won, she would ask for help for her country. The emperor said that this would not happen anytime soon. But still the young lady was skeptical about the emperor's words, because she knew that the princess had been practicing ball control from an early age. The emperor said that he would win. The young lady knew that His Majesty's hunting skill was second to none. The young lady looked at the emperor and asked if he could take part in the nursing festival, which was held in the imperial palace. The emperor looked at her and asked who cared. He said with a grin that he created these rules, and he started a hunting festival so that he would have a reason to go somewhere. The emperor looked intently at his hand. The young lady understood that this was so, since it was very difficult for the emperor to get out somewhere due to his illness. This not only shows the world how he is doing, but also provides food for the people of the empire. And it also gives him a little room to breathe. But still, she was very sorry for the emperor that he could not just walk in peace. She looked at him and asked with a smile if he wanted to freshen up a little. The emperor looked at her in surprise, holding her hand. A moment later, he asked what she meant. She looked at him and said with a smile that it was late, but they had some moonlight. She held his hand tenderly. The emperor fixed his gaze on the documents. He was surprised by this proposal. A moment later, he looked at his companion and asked her to wait a little. The emperor said that he did not want to go out because he could not do it, and she knows perfectly why. The lady looked at the emperor and softly asked if he still heard voices in his head. She asked him if he still saw the dark shadows that blurred in front of him. She smiled and said that he said earlier that shadows, hallucinations, and pain all disappear when she holds his hand. She smiled and said that's why he could just follow her. Some time later, they were walking leisurely on the street. The emperor was puzzled, as he had not seen his companion so close to him for a long time. The young lady noticed that the emperor hardly spoke. She knew that he seemed to be enjoying the wonderful silence now. She was very happy and pleased that he was comfortable. The young lady was glad that he could give him some peace and quiet. She was very glad that they were able to go outside. She was happy that she could just give him a little freedom.